Professor Glory continued to tell the boys that they had to keep moving forward, but they had to stay as close to each other as possible, because if they relaxed too much, they could get into big trouble. One of the guys got incredibly cold during this hike, and he had no idea what the problem was or why he was so cold. Arthur, looking at all this, was a little surprised that the guys were so weak, but on the other hand, he understood them perfectly, although the other guys thought that they only needed to listen to Professor Glory because she had already told them a long time ago that they should strengthen themselves with mana, and that way they would not freeze. At the same time, the boy understood that without using deception, his body did not feel the influence of the environment as much, thanks to Sylvie's dragon will. But what amazed the boys most was that even though there was a dungeon in which, according to legend, many different monsters lived, it was still so beautiful that it was hard to look away. The professor decided to point out that if they hadn't been listening to her in class, she would repeat that this was a D-rank dungeon called the Widow's Crypt. So she decided to point out, and the fact that given this information, they wouldn't be going below the second floor, so the only monsters to worry about were the so-called howlers. The Nogis in the group had read about these monsters and knew very well that before the trip, the howlers were not particularly strong, but they were difficult to destroy due to their thick skin, not to mention that they were so ugly that you didn't even want to go near them. One of the group, hearing this, decided to ask one question, which was whether a group of adventurers had recently passed through here. The answer to this question was quite simple. According to one of the girls and their squad, Professor Gloria said that a few days ago she asked the guild to restrict adventurer access to this dungeon, so it is not strange that they never met adventurers. But still, Professor Gloria couldn't get the thought out of her head that they had gone through quite a lot of this dungeon, and therefore it seemed to her that they should have encountered a decent number of rounds by now. But so far, they hadn't met a single one, which seemed very, very strange. So she turned to her students and again asked them to keep their eyes open, because just because there were no monsters on the horizon was not a reason to relax. In any case, this caused even more worries and fear, because not everyone understood what the point of staying here was if there were no monsters or interesting animals here. So after some time, they finally decided to contact the professor and ask her what they would do if there were no animals on either the first or second floor. Would they really go down even deeper? Professor Glory immediately gave them clear answers, saying that they would under no circumstances do anything like that because it was incredibly dangerous and they would most likely just leave this dungeon. She also calculated that if they didn't find anyone on the first 2 floors, it would be best to inform the Adventurers Guild and return to training. For some, this brought a smile, because then they thought they would be able to hunt the beasts near the dungeon. One of them was so carried away by this thought that he didn't even notice Professor Glory in front of him, who stopped at one point, causing him to collide with her. But she continued to stare away and tell her students that they urgently needed to step back, although it was a little unclear to them. But after a few seconds, everything became perfectly clear, because in complete darkness they saw a huge number of red eyes, which could only belong to monsters, who would definitely not spare the guys and destroy them at the first opportunity. I didn't have to think for long, and everything immediately became clear. It was a huge flock that was apparently waiting for the guys to go as deep into the dungeon as possible and destroy them there. But there was no point in fighting him, since they most likely would not be able to win this fight, so they made a decision and immediately began to run away, as the professor told them. The professor, in turn, decided that she needed to enter this duel and do everything possible to buy as much time as possible for the boys, so that they could escape. Gloria understood perfectly well that these howlers were no different from ordinary ones, but she still noticed that it was not typical for them to gather in flocks like this, so in any case, this was incredibly strange for her. After some time, she returned to her students and began to talk about how, in fact, defeating these creatures is not so difficult. The only thing that confuses her is their behavior, which was extremely unusual, and considering that first and foremost she must take care of their safety, she declares this excursion over. But before she could finish speaking and tell the boys to leave immediately, she suddenly felt a warmth behind her body, which was caused by a huge stream of fire. The fire was caused by one of those students who complained the most about the cold, and after he caused this stream of fire, he decided to say that safety does not play any role here, and in general he does not understand why they came here if as soon as something interesting began, they leave. He also said that it would be quite easy to deal with these guys, in which he was supported by the other guys, who also began to tell the professor that if they stayed, nothing terrible would happen. Besides, as they had already said, this dungeon was only D rank. After thinking for a bit, they began to persuade the professor that perhaps they should stay and train in this dungeon, and besides, such an opportunity comes up very rarely, and it is worth taking advantage of. Arthur, given everything they had said, could perfectly understand why Professor Gloris had doubts, especially considering that the copy was quite active in exploring the dungeons. Glory, in turn, understood perfectly well that depending on what copy was found inside the dungeon, these students might not have any chance to gain any practical experience. Besides, it was only the lowest-ranking beasts who were jealous, so as long as she was here, everything should be fine. In the end, she made her decision and allowed the students to explore the dungeon a little more. But before that, she asked them to split into teams and concentrate on one floor, because she didn't want them to be caught by spells. While the boys were being divided into teams, Gloria approached Lucas and told him that if he said something like that again, she would definitely confront him with consequences that he would definitely not be able to cope with. Meanwhile, Arthur listened as they told him that he was very good in close combat, and that's why they wanted him to be in the vanguard of one of the groups. As for Clive and Roland, they were asked to stand behind Arthur on the left and right respectively, so that they could cover him, even if they missed a couple of animals. As for Lucas, the girl asked him to take a position in the center, because they would move in a diamond formation, as they were taught in class. But Lucas believed that he himself knew perfectly well what to do, so he told the guys directly that they should stop taking him so seriously. Besides, in his opinion, this was just an excursion, during which they should practice a little. Clive clearly didn't like the guy's behavior and wanted to say a few kind words, but Arthur stopped him in time and made it clear that there was no point in it. Besides, they already had more serious problems, because they were already under attack from monsters who came running to the howl of their friends. Arthur was the first to enter this duel and, out of pride, destroyed the first monster that almost touched Roland. But this was only the beginning, because after a few minutes, there were so many monsters that they had to seriously use their weapons and show everything they were capable of. With the help of magic, they quickly destroyed dozens of monsters at once, and even though they had tough skin, this was not a problem at all for the guys. Laren, looking at how her students were doing, could only think that thanks to training they were doing quite well. But she, like no one else, understood the fact that they weren't that experienced guys and were clearly not used to protracted battles, and besides, the amount of Renova wasn't decreasing, only increasing, and at some point this could become a big problem for them. So she decided that the team should listen to their leader and follow her, and she in turn decided that they needed to return immediately. Well, apparently it was too late, because as soon as she screamed this and the guys started running away, one of them got into trouble. He was literally captured by several dozen monsters that were ready to tear the guy into small pieces. Professor Glory immediately sprang into action. She understood that in this case she would need to deliver one strong blow that would help blow away these monsters at once. Otherwise, they would have even more problems. She understood that she had only one option and only one type of strike, but the problem was that she had never used this strike in real life. She only practiced it in training. She could only hope that it would work and everything would turn out well. Otherwise, then serious problems would arise for both her and the other guys. Before delivering her blow, she shouted to the student, and then that he urgently needed to grab onto something and hold on as tightly as possible. He had no choice but to do what his power, Professor Glory, allowed, and over time, he managed to hold on. The same could not be said for the monsters, which the woman blew away with just one blow. But their problems did not end there, because as soon as the professor helped one of the students, she turned her head and saw a powerful explosion. Arthur, looking at all this, couldn't believe his eyes. Apparently, it was simply impossible. But apparently, it was all real, and the boys needed to take action immediately, because a few minutes after the battle with the regular monsters, they would encounter monsters that could fly, and these monsters were much stronger. In addition to the fact that these monsters could fly, they also used the power of their voice, which created unusual waves of sound that made it impossible to be near them. Gloria understood perfectly well that Queen Rev had apparently been forgotten on this floor because she simply had no other explanation, because, as was known to absolutely everyone, no one had ever seen the Queen on the first floors. In any case, now was not the time to talk about it. She needed to gather all her strength into a fist as quickly as possible and begin to destroy these monsters in order to save her students. And for this, she took out her second sword and activated the maximum amount of Taman. With this technique, she was able to destroy first one, then two, and then more than 10 such monsters with just one swing of the ball. But apparently the battle didn't end there, and the monsters continued to attack her. I hope that they will be able to destroy her today. She, in her time, continued to actively destroy one after another, doing it so easily that it seemed like a normal training session for her. She ordered her students to defend the passage and try to leave this dungeon. As for the Queen, she would deal with her herself. Arthur noticed a dolphin next to him, whose expression was confused and very worried that something would happen to her, so Arthur decided to shout at her and tell her to follow him. The other students gathered in a circle and continued to destroy the monster, telling Arthur there to leave and that they would cover them. It turned out that Arthur hadn't taken the dolphin with him for no reason. He knew perfectly well that the girl possessed special magic, and so he brought her to the place where a huge hole needed to be closed. While she was doing this, the guy promised her that he would protect her and that nothing would happen to her. She didn't mind, but immediately warned him that it would take some time. The battle continued actively. Most of the students were actively fighting and trying to destroy as many monsters as possible in order to eventually get out of this hell. But with each passing second, it turned out that the monsters were getting bigger and bigger. Luckily, TC was next to them, and with her skills, she helped each of the students, which is why they still held on to the lead and were ready to continue this battle. After some time, the dolphin managed to close the hole, and all that was left for them to do was clear the path that leads to the exit from the dungeon. Arthur did not wait long and think about something, and as soon as he realized that he was able to do it, he gathered all his strength in his fist and delivered a powerful enough blow that literally smashed all the stones that were in front of him. That's why they managed to clear a large part of the rubble, but it still didn't solve their problem, because he understood perfectly well that they needed to clear it all at once. Otherwise, the rubble would only get bigger, and then it would definitely be difficult for them to get out. But suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted by a very strange smell that came from the monster they had already destroyed. And after a few minutes, he noticed Lucas actively using his fire magic and shouting that there were too many of these monsters and they kept getting in his way, so he had no choice but to destroy them with one blow. Thus it became clear that all these bodies of dead monsters blocked the only passage for air, and now they were trapped. Arthur immediately started shouting to all the guys there so that they would immediately stop using all fire spells and, if possible, put out their fire. Otherwise, they would run out of oxygen too quickly before they could come up with something. After which he noted that if they wanted to deal with the rubble, they would need to blow it up. It turned out that they shouldn't be too careful, because without enough oxygen, it would be hard for them to think clearly. At that moment, Arthur's pet Sylvie mentally addressed him, wanting to know what was going on, to which the guy replied that they were currently stuck in a dungeon, so he ordered him to head here and tell him what the flow looked like from the outside. Suddenly, while thinking about this, a very good idea came to Arthur's mind, so he quickly called Curtis to him and asked him to do something. He spoke of his peace cry being strong enough to deal with it, though Curtis was far from certain that he had both the strength and mana to actually make it a reality. Arthur asked him for only one thing: to turn around and not ask any unnecessary questions. All he needed to do at that moment was to concentrate and try to enter his first stage in order to create an explosion that could clear all this rubble. As for the dolphin, he asked her to help the others, who were holding back the monsters and not allowing them to break through further. After he had given out all the commands and his friends had begun to do these tasks, the boy began to think that he needed to remember all the ways of transferring mana that they had studied over the years. But he soon quickly realized that it was useless to waste time on this. After all, in his opinion, even if the elements of two magicians are the same, this does not mean that the mana of these elements themselves in their bodies is the same. But since he can already control all four elements, then most likely he will be able to simulate the required type of mana and control the required percentage content of each element in it. Even though he was aware of the fact that he had not yet fully honed all this perfection and had only tried to do it a couple of times, he still made a decision and used his technique, despite all doubts, because he understood perfectly well that they essentially had no other options. Moreover, all this happened because of his excessive carelessness, so he must fix it, because when he entered the dungeon, he thought that there would be nothing complicated here. Afterwards, he made a mistake a second time, when he thought that if something happened, he could save everyone, even though at such a young age he already possessed the power that he had in his past life. But in the end, this led him to stop assessing the situation soberly. Therefore, he decided to do the following and provide a huge amount of power to his friend, whose ability immediately after receiving such a buff increased almost tenfold, due to which his ability called the Roar of the World was able to destroy a huge number of monsters in its path. After they finished with this new operation, Arthur suggested that he finish it and start getting all the guys out of this terrible place. At this point, Gloria continued to actively fight and destroyed one monster after another. For her, it was not at all difficult, but because she was worried about the students and the fact that there was so much danger around, her confidence was falling more and more with each passing second. However, even in this state, these monsters were not something dangerous or serious for her, so with a few blows, she could destroy a huge number of enemies at once. The thing concerns Arthur, so at that moment, he was carefully watching Professor Glory and caught himself thinking that even using a fairly strong deviant magic of glass shards, which was created thanks to her growth with two elements, she was still forced to retreat, which was a little wild for him. In any case, there was nothing he could do now, so he continued to evacuate along with the other guys, until he heard words in the crowd that there seemed to be a shortage of them, and that there were fewer of them. Suddenly, a girl with a staff fell on his shoulders who could barely stand on her feet. From her indistinct and weak speech, it was immediately clear that her inner core had simply dried up. All that was left for the guy at that moment was to tell her that they would get there soon, and she could not worry about it. As they walked out, the boy couldn't help but think that all of this was incredibly dangerous, and he was especially worried about the question of where there were two queens in this dungeon. Even though they were only B-rank monsters, even then, it should have been just a simple battle for an A-rank adventurer like Professor Glory. But in the end, it definitely wasn't like that. In any case, all this did not fully come together in his head, and at some point he already decided that it was time to stop thinking about it. But apparently these thoughts cannot just leave him alone, and literally a few seconds later, an earthquake began under them. When they turned around and saw the cause of the earthquake, even Professor Glory had fear in her eyes, and this fear was not only for her life, but for the lives of the boys. Literally out of nowhere, a huge monster appeared out of the darkness, creating enormous pressure on everything around it, which is apparently what caused the fear. Glory didn't have time to scream for all the guys to immediately start running for the exit, when the monster's hand appeared right next to her. A few seconds later, she received a powerful blow from this monster, which caused her to fly back several meters. She could hardly stop, because if she hadn't done this, it would have been unknown whether she would have been able to continue the fight or not. After which, this monster decided to attack the students who were nearby, which would most likely lead to a terrible tragedy and death. But at the last moment, a huge number of horses fell upon this monster, which immediately made it clear that someone had intervened in the battle. It was Gloria, who had recovered quite quickly, and already using her strength to the maximum, was shouting at this monster to come to her immediately, because they were not finished yet, and their fight would only just begin. Arthur, looking at this whole situation, understood perfectly well that everything was very bad, and if he didn't do something, then Professor Glory would not be able to get out of here safe and sound. The other guys interrupted his thoughts and continued shouting at him not to stand and watch all this, but to immediately leave with them, because they thought that they needed to get away from there as quickly as possible. But he believed that he couldn't just run away, so he handed over the girl he was carrying and asked the guys to pull her out for him while he helped the professor. They immediately tried to stop him, even though they understood that he had an affinity with two elements, but they believed that he should not act so rashly, and in their opinion, they should leave this monster to Professor Glory. But Arthur didn't respond with words. He just used another element, thereby removing the hand of the guy who was trying to detain him. And after your appearance, it immediately became clear that he could cope with this problem, and they had no doubts about it. At first, they thought they were having a mass hallucination, because they couldn't believe they were seeing real flames engulfing the guy. At this point, Gloria continued to actively fight the monster and tried to destroy it with her own strength. With each passing second, it became more and more difficult for her to control this monster. In her mind, she understood perfectly well that she knew that the mana of beasts could eat each other, but she had never heard of them evolving after that. For her, it was something unthinkable. Suddenly, her thoughts were interrupted when Arthur intervened in the fight, shouting for her to duck, and then launched an incredibly powerful attack at the giant. Glory couldn't believe her eyes. She looked at the guy and saw the flame, which shocked her. It seemed to her that it was simply impossible, and everything she saw was just ordinary hallucinations due to extreme fatigue. But it didn't take long for her to realize that this was actually reality, and everything she saw was true. The guy really did use fire, and did it very well. In any case, she decided to remind him that she had ordered them all to leave immediately, so she had questions about what he was even doing here. The guy responded by saying that he thought it was none of her professor colleagues' business. While they were talking and trying to figure out why the guy disobeyed her order, the monster didn't wait and continued to attack, its powers allowing it to deal incredibly powerful blows with the help of an earthquake, so strong that the guys literally flew back several meters, not understanding how they could resist it. In any case, Arthur took the time to say that he noticed that not one of her blows was able to reach the target. This made the woman smile, so she decided to ask the guy if he really came here just to laugh at her. Arthur took this too seriously and immediately began to justify himself, saying that he only came to her aid because he thought that she might not be able to cope on her own. Glory realized that she had no other choice and would have to fight alongside the guy, because given his every word, she was almost certain that he would not just leave here, so she made sure that all the students had left, and only after that was she ready to begin the real fight. She activated incredibly powerful magic around herself, and then began to talk about how this monster would not pursue them outside the dungeon, so their only correct option in this case would be to wear her out so that they could then escape. Arthur immediately said there that he was ready to do it without any problems, and all he asked the girl was to distract this monster for some measly 10 seconds so that he could pay for one idea. For Glory, this was not a big problem. The only thing that worried her at that moment was the thought that it turned out that Arthur had an affinity with the three elements, which seemed literally crazy at such a young age. But in any case, now was not the best time to think about it, because she needed to immediately destroy this monster, or at least distract its arching so that Arthur could carry out his part of the plan. Well, at some point she miscalculated her strength and realized that her bone literally cracked from the incredible energy that she had been trying to control all this time. So she decided that she and Arthur needed to escape immediately, and their plan was simply impossible to carry out. It seemed like they had succeeded, but at the last moment, the monster, right before the exit, scared them when it tried to follow Arthur. He stuck one of his claws into his leg, thereby causing him not only incredible pain, but also stopping him. The most interesting thing happened next. The monster's huge hand began to glow purple, as if it was about to explode, which made the boys freeze. And just a few seconds later, a powerful explosion thundered, which caused an explosive stir and threw the guys closer to the exit. Arthur was much less fortunate, because he didn't reach the slope and fell down along with this huge monster, and all that Gloria could do at that moment was scream the guy's name and hope that he would be able to get out. But his free fall continued. With every second he moved further and further away from the light. At some point he came to his senses and gradually began to realize what was happening, and this was not the best news for him at that moment. Using mana, he pushed himself towards one of the walls to somehow get a grip and try to get out. Unfortunately, his hands were too slippery, so he was unable to get a firm enough grip to continue climbing. So at one point, he finally came to the conclusion that he had no choice. All that was left for him at the moment was to try to survive the fall. Even with the mana rotation technique, he didn't have much left in reserve, so that was the worst problem at the moment. But Arthur was not going to give up and decided for himself that he would do everything possible to get out and return to his friends. So, with the help of the wind flow, he was eventually able to land softly on the ground without damaging anything important. For some time, he simply lay on the ground unconscious, his body trying to restore the strength that the guy lost while trying to land successfully on the ground. When he opened his eyes, he realized that he didn't have the strength to even move. His mana was so low that he could barely breathe. After some time, he recovered a little and was finally able to rise to his knees, sat in that position for a while, and was finally able to think about what he should do next. Looking around, at some point he saw a sword, which surprised him incredibly because it was that very sword. After which he began to actively approach him, thinking at the same time that first his senses had become heightened, and now the regeneration process had also significantly intensified, which could only mean one thing: Sylvie's will truly works miracles. He pulled the sword out of the monster and a small void formed in his head. He wanted to think about what to do next and how to solve this problem. At the same time, he had the thought that even in his best shape, it would be quite difficult for him to climb back up this tunnel. At some point, his attention was drawn to another passage, which was glowing, as if luring the guy to go through it and forget about what was outside. Arthur understood that he apparently had no other choice, and he would literally have to go through this tunnel. Besides, he heard the sounds of running water, and it seemed to him that there, in the depths of this tunnel, there was a chance that he could get out. His senses did not fail him. After a few seconds, he was already standing in the center of the waterfall, which was surrounded by solid water. But after going a little further, the guy saw a terrible picture that made him freeze in a motionless state and just watch as a huge number of knights were destroyed by someone unknown. Suddenly, he heard a cough and immediately grabbed his sword tightly in his hands and turned around, shouting at the same time, "Is there anyone here at all?" In response, he received a request for help, which was quite unexpected for the guy, so he immediately jumped up and ran to help. But he very quickly lost this man among the huge number of corpses, so he asked this man to say one more word or at least give some kind of sign so that it would be easier for the guy to find him. Well, a few seconds later, the guy's attention was drawn to the very same man who somehow miraculously managed to survive. And no matter how Arthur imagined this person, he certainly did not expect this, because in front of him was Alea, an old acquaintance whom he had known for many years. He couldn't believe his eyes. He immediately ran up to her and started telling her that it was simply impossible and how this even happened. She tried to answer him something, but Arthur immediately asked her not to speak and to save her strength, after which he tried to use the regeneration skill from the last of his mana to at least help her recover a little. The girl, taking into account his every word, immediately assumed that they had apparently met before, to which the guy replied that his name was Arthur, and he was the boy they had met at Cyrus's academy, and he also reminded the girl that she had told him that their brother could be his peer. She began to remember little by little, and eventually she finally said that he was the boy who was following Byron. But this became an even bigger shock for her, because she couldn't even imagine how he could get here. Every word was incredibly difficult for her, so Arthur asked her not to speak and to save her strength to the maximum, because it was already difficult for him to use regeneration. If she spoke, the process would increase. But in response to these words, she sighed and told him with a smile that he himself must understand perfectly well that he would no longer be able to save her and that most likely The end had come for her. He really understood this perfectly, so all he could do at that moment was tell the girl that he was very sorry, to which she smiled even more and said that he had nothing to apologize for, and besides, it was thanks to him that she felt much better. Arthur understood that she was saying this only because she would die very soon, so he wanted to do something else for her, although he did not understand what exactly he needed, so he decided to just ask directly. In response to this question, she couldn't just give it to him, so after a few seconds, the guy simply couldn't hold back and started shouting that he simply didn't understand how this could have happened and why she was in such a state. She spoke to him with the last of her strength, which is why the guy had to listen to her every word. But even in this state, he clearly heard her ask him why he thought she was still alive. The guy didn't even have any idea what she was talking about, so he immediately gave her an answer. He said that he didn't even have the slightest idea what could have happened, so the girl told him directly that whoever did this just wanted to keep her alive out of revenge. Arthur listened very attentively, but even so, he did not quite understand what was being discussed and who was the person who could do this to them. In response to these words, she extended her hand to him, on the palm of which dark energy was clearly visible, and then she added that his revenge was because she dared to hurt him. After which, she asked him to come closer to her, because even with her core destroyed, she still had to show him something special that would clearly be useful to him in the future. And as soon as the guy got close enough, he began to see her memories. He experienced all the horror that the girl had recently had to endure. A huge snake appeared before his eyes, which apparently destroyed all the warriors who lay here. The monster that controlled this snake left no one alive for many hundreds of years. Every time new victims came to him, he offered them to play a game, which consisted of them being able to choose one of two options. The first of which was that they would start fighting against him, or there was a second option, when the warriors had to destroy all of their allies in order to survive themselves. Each time, the squads chose the first option. They believed that this monster was playing a bad game with them, and therefore decided to attack it. But each time he was surprised that they thought their actions would have any effect, because in reality, no matter what they did, the war would still start. He also said more than once in his life that he was going to give them a quick death, but now he changed his mind and will do everything to ensure that each of them suffers until the last second of their miserable lives. After such a session, Arthur understood everything. He understood who was to blame for all this horror. He understood what happened here, and finally realized that he really had nothing to help the girl with. After that, all she could say to him was words of apology, and also added that no one should have seen something like that, especially a boy his age. However, Arthur in turn certainly didn't think so, because as soon as she finished speaking, the guy immediately began to say that someone definitely had to tell about what happened here. At least now he knows exactly what they had to go through, and to begin with, he decided to thank the girl for her faithful service and for what she did for him. She couldn't hold back her tears and ended up bursting into tears, after which she began to repeat that what she didn't want to do more than die. She screamed that she was very scared and she didn't know what would happen next. So Arthur quickly made a decision and hugged her. He believed that at the moment this was all he could do, although he so wanted to heal her. He repeated to her several times that she had nothing to worry about because he was always by her side and would remain until that happened. He convinced himself that Alea's death was not in vain, because thanks to her memories, he was able to learn about the black-footed demon who managed to do something like this. Although he didn't know their exact number, he was well aware of the fact that they were definitely looking for something, just like the first demon he had encountered in Sylvie's cave. Regardless of whether this demon wanted to get Celia or the whole Delicatessen, it all became completely unimportant, because in Arthur's head, the only thoughts were that Leon, who was strong enough, but even we didn't have a single chance for him in that battle. If what the demon said about the impending war was true, then the guy simply had no right to remain inactive. In order to protect those whom he would eventually love and become much closer to, he needed to become strong enough to be able to protect them. He buried every single warrior and promised them that they could now rest in peace and that someday people would return to them who would take them from here. This was the promise he made to each of them before he left. After which, he approached Sylvie and thanked her for waiting for him, although there was no joy at all in his voice. Sylvie tried to cheer Arthur up, but the boy assured him that there was absolutely no need for that, because he was more than fine. After which, he suggested to his faithful friend to get out of here as quickly as possible because he could no longer tolerate such scenes. Moreover, unfortunately, they can't do anything more here. They have already done everything they could, and all that remains is to not die themselves. After some time, Arthur and his pet successfully reached the nearest castle, where two knights met them at the entrance. One of them blocked Arthur's way because he had no idea what the child was doing there, especially since it was so late, so he wanted to look at Arthur's ID before letting him in. Arthur was surprised by this, because he thought it was obvious that he was from Cyrus's academy, but he still noticed it again, and he also added that he was returning from excursions from the widow's crypt. Hearing this, one of the knights was even more surprised that they had only recently heard about the widow's crypt, where an unfortunate incident occurred, as a result of which people died. Arthur, looking at them, understood that apparently more than half of the entire kingdom already knew about this, so he simply nodded his head, thereby making it clear that he returned from this very place. After this, the knight waved his hand and ordered his colleague to immediately report this to Cyrus Academy and the Adventurers Guild. He then turned back to Arthur and began to tell the boy that the Adventurers Guild was assembling a rescue team to search for him, so he asked him to wait here while he brought a healer who could treat his wounds. Arthur immediately stopped him and began to say that with all due respect to the knight, he would just like to return home, and he also wanted to report to the Cyrus Academy tomorrow, and at the same time, he was ready to fill out his paperwork about it. After which Arthur successfully arrived home, and before going inside, he thought that most likely the guys were already waiting for him there, and everyone was most likely worried about him. He also understood that if he went in, they would ask him about what happened and how he managed to get out. Taking all these thoughts into account, he came to the conclusion that he was well aware that he was behaving selfishly, but he also did not think that he could cope with it. Looking at his hand, he couldn't forget Aaliyah's last words, which often sounded in his head every time his other thoughts disappeared. Her fear of loneliness and her fear of death, no matter if it was luck or someone else's plan, he just hoped that her end would be the same as his. As his friend's thoughts were interrupted by a man who suddenly emerged from the castle, having previously told the boy that the surrounding area was incredibly beautiful, so at moments like these, he understood all the advantages of city life. This man was Arthur's father, to whom the boy did not have time to say a word, as the man assured him that the boy did not need to say anything or explain anything. After these words, they just sat in silence for a while, each of them thinking about their own things. After a short pause and tense silence, the man finally spoke up about something the boy might not have noticed, but his mother couldn't treat serious wounds. Then he began to talk about how his mother, like Arthur now, has her own scars that she cannot talk about. So he asked the guy not to force himself, because in his opinion, each of them has their own battle that they have to fight. But what was most important for the man at that moment was that he would definitely do the same as he did with Arthur's mother, namely, he would stay next to the guy, waiting for him to win. After all, it seemed to him that life was not just one battle, so it was okay if he got beaten a couple of times. The most important thing was that the guy found the strength to get up and continue on his way. These words touched the boy so deeply that he began to cry and even scream at times. It seemed to him that an entire army had lined up around him, ready to protect him from any danger. The next day, Arthur, standing on the castle balcony, looked at the beautiful view from above, when suddenly he was interrupted by the headman, who told the guy that he could come to her office himself. After which, she noted that she had not seen his friend Mana the Beast for a long time, to which Arthur told her that he asked the beast to stay at home. Considering what happened in the dungeon, the woman decided to literally order the guy to rest, and then decided to find out what his plans were regarding this. Arthur noted with a smile that he already had some plans, since he had promised his mother and sister to go shopping with them, and after that, they were supposed to come up with some other entertainment. After a short pause, the woman finally made up her mind and asked Arthur what exactly had happened there. Professor Gloria had already told her about the anomalies that had affected the queen of the howler monkeys, but she was still interested in what else had happened there. Arthur didn't wait long and immediately turned to her, and then took out the pendant that Alia had given him as a parting gift, and with such an expression, he didn't say that everything that had happened didn't matter, because all that was left was this one and only pendant. He gave this pendant into the hands of the woman, and as soon as she saw what kind of pendant it was and who it belonged to, shock took over her body. After which, Arthur confirmed the woman's suspicions and told her that the body of the girl and her team were still on the lower floor of the widow's crypt, but he sincerely wasn't sure that they would ever be able to get there. The woman, hearing this, immediately thought that if the girl was destroyed, then they must have been here for a long time, after which she told the guy that she was very sorry that he had to listen to this, but she still had one question for him. The question was incredibly simple. All she wanted to know from him was, did he see who could have done this? Arthur immediately assured her that he had not seen anything like this, and therefore could not give her detailed information. In any case, the woman assured that she still needed to immediately report the incident to the council so that they could make a decision and provide them with a solution to this problem. She also asked Arthur not to think about it anymore, because in her opinion, it was not something he should worry about. Besides, the council and the remaining copy themselves would deal with whoever caused this. Arthur, in turn, could only hope that this was exactly how it would be, although he had certain doubts about the warriors being able to cope with the one who had inflicted such great damage on an entire detachment. The next day, Arthur, a month old, and his friends decided to visit several stores selling clothes and other small items to take their minds off the situation that had happened to them quite recently. At some point during this hike, Arthur decided to turn to Aunt Tabitha and ask her to tell him if there were any stores nearby where he could buy some training materials. The first thing she thought was that he was talking about the so-called elixirs that had recently become very popular among the warriors, so she immediately told him that there was a very famous store nearby, so if Arthur wanted, she promised him that they could look there. They offered him to go with them, but the guy immediately assured them that it was not necessary and he could handle it alone, so at that very second, he put all his things on the floor and assured them that he would find them himself later, and also asked them not to worry about him and continue having fun. As he walked down the street, at some point, he saw a memorial grave where Ali's expression was buried, and for this reason, all possible images of how it had happened popped into the guy's head. He was a little scared that they could all face this. Over time, he finally came to the store that Tabe had spoken about, and looking at it, the thought flashed through his head that this store did not look at all like the residents described it, because it looked abandoned and absolutely no one could sell medicine there. For him, this place was more like an abode of poisons and corruption, but not of medicine or any elixirs. As a friend, his thoughts were interrupted by a man who asked Arthur for some change, which caused the guy to become quite scared. What scared the guy most was the fact that he didn't immediately notice the man's energy. At that moment, the man himself continued to smile and ask him for money, and he also asked Arthur not to look at him as if he saw a ghost, because he was just an ordinary old man who was begging for alms. Arthur quickly came to his senses and decided to get some money from his pocket, while thinking about how this old man even got to this point. And before Arthur could even extend his hand, which held several coins, the old man snatched the coins away, without even having time to thank the guy. But a few seconds later, when he already had the money in his hands, he turned to Arthur again and thanked him for the small handout. But Arthur was not entirely happy about this, because he had accidentally given the old man a silver coin, which was much more than he had planned. Before he could tell the old man that he was going to give him a completely different coin, the old man instantly disappeared and took the silver coin with him. Quite upset, Arthur continued on to the store he had come to, but now he didn't have much motivation because he had lost a large sum of money. But as soon as he got closer to this store, he immediately noticed that the door handle was shrouded in some strange magic, which is why the guy immediately assumed that apparently they were checking customers in this store or something like that. As soon as he grabbed the handle and tried to open the door, a small explosion occurred around him, which pulled smoke with it, but Arthur was still able to enter inside. And as soon as he cleared his throat a little and the smoke cleared, the guy immediately saw the same old man to whom he had just given a silver coin, and the old man, in turn, asked the guy with a smile how he could help him. Arthur immediately began to demand that he give him his coin, because the old man had deceived him and had initially said that he was homeless. But now the guy was more than sure that this was not true at all. But the old man immediately assured the guy that he had initially said that he was an ordinary elderly man. But the fact that he was homeless was something the guy had made up himself. In any case, the old man decided to offer a solution for Arthur, so he allowed him to choose absolutely any one thing of his choice for free, and then they would be even with him. Arthur thought that this offer was not entirely private, because in his opinion, there was nothing here that could be worth even one silver coin, although according to the old man, there were a lot of things here that were worth much more. And considering these offers, Arthur would need to have a very keen eye to take something very expensive for one silver coin. After these words, Arthur smiled and thought about how he should respect his elders. He repeated this several times and realized that perhaps not all was lost. He started walking around the store and examining the things that were there. He immediately noticed that this store was incredibly old, if only for the reason that it hadn't been cleaned for about 10 years. But the old man assured him that physical labor was bad for the elderly, and therefore he believed that his shop was in good condition. After some time, he found a rather expensive thing. At least it seemed so to him. It was a small ring that was in a box, which looked very expensive. But in any case, in the guy's opinion, it seemed to him that if he spent a little more time here, he would definitely go crazy. So he decided that he simply had to find at least something that would be worth the coins spent. But in the end, he couldn't find anything worth anything that was even close to the same value as the silver coin he gave the old man. Therefore, he decided to tell him that they would probably have to break off their deal. But even after these words, the old man continued to stand and just look at him with his surprised gaze, as if he had understood something. Arthur waited a bit for an answer, but then he tried to contact the old man again and find out if Leon was okay and why he was frozen. At some point, the man finally came to his senses, cleared his throat a little, and apologized to the guy for ignoring him, after which he thought and said that he meant that everything was fine with him. Arthur realized that he had to continue this conversation anyway, so he repeated to the old man that he hadn't been able to find anything he liked, so if the man just gave him his money back, he would just leave, and there wouldn't be any problems. In the opinion of the old men, the guy was too impudent, and he was not going to let him go so easily, so he approached one of the counters and started talking about the fact that the guy really did not have Nayo's given eye. If anything, he threw the guy some strange thing and said that it should do the trick. Arthur looked closely at this thing and wondered what it was and how it could be used. The old man did not explain anything to him, but simply began to move out of his store and simultaneously say that the guy should not worry about it, because it would definitely be useful to him. And now that they had discussed everything, the guy could immediately leave here. Before Arthur could say anything about this, the old man closed the door in his face, and that was the end of their dialogue. After leaving this store, Arthur noticed a cat in front of him, who was looking at him very attentively. While walking around the city, Arthur at some point noticed his acquaintances, who also saw him and decided to invite him to come closer to them. Approaching them, he noticed all his friends who wanted to ask him if he was able to find what he was looking for. Before Arthur could answer, one of them started saying that she would be surprised if he didn't find anything among the variety of elixirs and medicines in that very store, because according to her, it was such a good store that it was impossible to find what you were looking for there. She also said it was always full of students trying to get new training materials, which made Arthur very dubious, as he thought it was the worst store in town. But the girls assured him they would never say it was shabby, and at that moment, Arthur began to wonder if they were talking about different places. A few minutes later, they arrived at the very place the girls had spoken of, and looking there, Arthur was convinced that they really meant different places. Tlisinai, which the girls had spoken of, was incredibly beautiful and well-groomed. At that moment, Lucas just came to one of the secret meetings, where I met him, one of the leaders of this movement. The man who brought Lucas to this meeting immediately turned to his lord and said that, as I promised, he brought Lucas to this place. The guy who was sitting in the center of this whole meeting was wearing a mask that spoke for itself. But even with that expression on his face, he managed to say that he was very glad that he could join their little movement. Lucas smiled at these words and said that he had not yet said that he would agree to this, much less join them, because according to him, he simply came here because Charlie said that they wanted to show him something. After which Lucas also noted with a laugh that he was interested to know who they were in general. They looked nothing like students, and he also did not want to hear that any of them were professors, which caused quite a lot of anger among the names, after which they asked him to be grateful for the fact that they allowed someone like him to join them. This insult had already affected Lucas himself, who, although he was smiling on the outside, was literally exploding with energy inside. He wanted to destroy each of them, thereby showing that none of them were worthy of his power. At that moment he realized that in fact nothing could stop him, and that with one snap of his finger he could stop everything here. And as soon as he lit a huge fire around himself, their leader immediately intervened in this conversation and noted that it was somehow wrong to say such a thing to their new recruit, and therefore suggested that they calm down and resolve the issue peacefully. But it was too late, because Lucas burned one of them, although he tried to shout to them that he was wrong and asked for their forgiveness. At some point, Lucas felt a little uneasy and thought he'd gone a bit overboard, though on the other hand, he realized it was a spell that couldn't be stopped, and besides, this guy had caused it himself. What was bothering him most at the moment was that he couldn't sense the mana level of these guys' heads at all, so he suggested the man return to his ult and tell him more information that would give him an idea of what they were doing here. At one point, Lucas was shown that they were the same group that bullied students and drugged them, but the masked leader immediately assured him that he would like to think that they were doing more than, as Lucas put it, drugging the kids, because in fact, according to him, he had grandiose plans that encompassed more than just this academy. But according to him, at the moment, circumstances prevented him from acting, and therefore now he needs capable magicians whom he can use as excellent weapons and equipment in order to carry out all his plans. Also, according to him, each of those present here is a dissatisfied nobleman who is proud of the fact that Cyrus was built only for those who have the purest bloodline, and, most likely, Lucas, in my opinion, is an exception. But on the other hand, he is confident that the motto of the students and the structure of this academy will still prevail. Lucas listened attentively, and as soon as the leader finished speaking, the boy immediately began asking him why he should waste his time and energy on bugs that he could slap at any moment, because it seemed to him that these commoners at the academy were no different from low-ranking adventurers who waved their weapons around. As for these spoiled nobles who stand behind him, for him they are like trash that someone simply forgot to throw away and they are still trying to prove something. After which, contrary to everything he had said before, he also added that he saw absolutely no point in stooping to their level just to become his dog and follow commands. And the words already caused laughter from the man in the mask, who, after all of Lucas's words, noted that apparently the rumors were not lying and he really is quite proud, who considers all people of the lower classes weaklings. But he also wanted to know whether his friend Arthur had not proven him wrong. Hearing these words, Lucas immediately turned around, and it was obvious from his face that he was incredibly angry and ready to destroy everyone who was near him, just because of one mention of Arthur. But before Luca could say a word, the leader decided to point out the fact that even if he was called a child prodigy, he was still a spoiled man who had been pampered with elixirs since his awakening, and therefore he was definitely not Arthur's equal. And what's saddest, according to the man in the mask, is that Arthur never even gave it his all, and even though he gave in, Lucas still couldn't defeat him. Although Lucas was as angry as he could be, in fact, no matter how disgusted he was to hear it, he understood perfectly well that it was the truth, and he would not run away from it. So at some point he couldn't take it anymore and shouted towards the man in the mask, and wanted to know who he was, that he decided to himself that he had the right to say such things. After this question, the masked man stood up, and after bowing, told Lucas that he was just a benefactor who had come here to improve these lands. Afterwards, he sat down again and told Lucas that he seemed to have made it clear that their cooperation would be mutually beneficial, so Lucas had better calm down and listen carefully. Lucas realized that this man had apparently been following him for several days now, and so there was no point in making excuses. All he could say at the moment was to ask the masked man to continue talking and tell him what he wanted to do. According to the leader of these people, he will soon have the opportunity to strike. When this happens, the fragile bonds between the three races will shatter into pieces. Besides, if we believe his words, he has already established control over the board and director of that academy, so the stage is set, and Lucas just has to perform well and show what a good actor he is. Lucas immediately realized that they were from these unfinished business, and there was Arthur, which caused delight in the man in the mask, and, according to him, Lucas has quite good, insightful logic, and his elven half did not affect his ability to think. The guy did not react to these words, and all he decided to say in response was to ask a question in which he wanted to find out that if the masked man was telling him that Arthur did not even give it his all, then how was he supposed to defeat him? And before he could give him an answer to this question, Lucas immediately assured him that if he thought that he would take the same drugs as Marcus, then he was very much mistaken. The head would have asked him to stop immediately and stop talking about it. Besides, in his opinion, Marcus was weak, and such substances would not have helped him in any case, which he cannot say about Lucas, because if he is as strong as he thinks himself, then the powers that he gives him, he will be able to control and thus defeat anyone. He also asked him to believe that these powers would be on a completely different level, which he could not reach on his own. Lucas thought about his words for a bit and finally said that, let it be so, but he was still interested to know how he planned to make Arthur fight him at full strength. According to the masked man, it was all quite simple, because Arthur is only human and he places great importance on his family and friends, but one person in particular. And then it finally dawned on Lucas what his interlocutor was talking about. He was talking about Tessa. After which, he shouted to all his subjects about whether they considered it right that the elf became the leader of the students, to which they confidently began to shout that this was disgusting and unacceptable, and the first thing they should do was correct this misunderstanding. And now that the mood around was warmed up, the leader of this group decided to tell Lucas about what Arthur would do if he lost even a drop of the elven princess's blood. This brought a crazy smile to Lucas's face, which could only mean one thing. He had agreed to this idea and was ready to make this crazy idea come true. At that moment, Arthur came to visit his friend to tell him that he seemed to have lost his keys, and therefore he would like to return them as soon as possible. But before he could come to an agreement, his friend threw himself into his arms and began to pour water on him as hard as he could. At first, Arthur was a little surprised, but then he took it as a compliment and assured his friend that he was fine and there was no need to worry about him so much. After some time, they were already sitting in the room and having a nice conversation about what really happened and how Arthur managed to survive in that terrible cave. Also, his friend at one point started telling him that the director of Good Sky came by yesterday to tell him not to worry about it. But remembering Claire's stories about what happened, it was incredibly difficult for him to believe that everything was okay with him. Arthur didn't quite expect to hear such words from his friend, so he decided to ask him a counter-question, in which he wanted to find out if everything would definitely be okay, to which his interlocutor confidently replied that Claire and Karis had been discharged from the hospital this morning. But as for Tess, in this case, things weren't as smooth as they would have liked. The whole thing was that the director of Hood Sky mentioned that she was currently in one of the training rooms with her grandfather, which incredibly surprised Arthur a lot, so he asked again to make sure what his friend was telling him. Arthur's friend confirmed this information with a smile and added that he had to meet with everyone so that they could make sure that the guy was okay and that they had nothing to worry about. Arthur himself did not argue with this. He understood perfectly well that he needed to meet with the rest of his friends and show that everything was okay with him, but still, even taking into account the misunderstanding, he still had some doubts about this. Arthur wasn't entirely sure that he was now capable of answering their questions and appearing right in front of them, because so much had happened, although he himself didn't fully understand how he should live with it further. So he got up and asked his friend to drop by the boardroom tomorrow to tell them that he had seen Arthur and that he was okay. In Arthur's opinion, he was more than sure that they would all believe his friend, and then they would have no more unnecessary questions. At least in this way, he would definitely be able to delay the moment when he would have to tell everything. The friend was at first a little disappointed that Arthur had decided to do just that, but soon he understood him perfectly and assured his friend that he could do it and would be happy to fulfill his request. After this, Arthur continued his journey, and leaving his friend, he thought about the fact that the director would-be Sky should be a private meeting with the council. As for the Virion, he would not miss the meeting with the council unless something very urgent happened. As a friend, his thoughts were interrupted by Silvera, who literally screamed that she felt her mother, which really scared her. Arthur jumped up and immediately ran towards the door, which was a little further away, in the hope that they would find what they were looking for. New inside, the first thing he saw was huge clouds of smoke that literally didn't give him the opportunity to see anything further than one Sao Men, so he screamed out loud, what was going on here and did anyone need his help? In answer to his question, he heard the voice of the old man, who noted that he was very glad that the boy had come and that he really needed his help. This did not surprise Arthur more than his ring, which miraculously began to glow and with its whole appearance showed that something strange was happening here. Arthur immediately realized that the ring wasn't just glowing, it was literally heating up because of something inside that smoke screen. They gave him a little to sell, he was still able to reach the man who was shouting back at the guy, and then he was surprised to see an old man doing some very strange things. He also screamed and wanted to know from the TC what had happened here and what he was doing at all, and the old man answered him with a scream that she had been in this state since she returned with the dungeon. Arthur could have come to this conclusion himself, so he was more interested in what had happened to her, to which the old man answered in an uncertain voice that something had happened to her uvos veri, which was causing problems with assimilation. In other words, it was as if she was trying to take over the test's body. Taking into account all this information, the old man came to the conclusion that there was something clearly wrong with the guardian of the ancient forest with whom Arthur had fought. After all, according to him, even after such a long assimilation, something is still wrong, as if the will has mutated and begun to play against the test itself. At that moment, Arthur immediately thought about the fact that I was taking into account every word the old man said. Most likely it was his fault, because he should not have given her that core. So he decided at that very moment to pull his hand closer to the body to test his theory and help if possible. Well, as soon as he reached out and touched this object, she immediately began to attack the guy and do everything to make him regret his choice. Even though it all worked out, the guy was able to return without causing himself any harm, but he was still mentally sure that if he had been a little less lucky, it could have easily destroyed him. But there was no way, there was no time to think about it, because this monster continued to attack the guy, and even the old man could not help him in this case. Although Arthur was prepared for this, even in this case it was quite difficult for us to turn away from each attack of this monster, which was incredibly fast. At some point, the old man was finally able to calm the creature down more or less, and decided to check with Arthur if everything was okay with him. Although Arthur wasn't going as smoothly as he would have liked, he assured the old man that he was fine. The only thing that worried him was that his granddaughter held a grudge against him, which sounded rather inappropriate, and so the old man decided to point out that now wasn't the best time for such jokes. Arthur completely agreed with him, because although it seemed that this creature had calmed down and the guy now had time to rest like a friend, this monster gathered his strength and decided to launch a new attack on the guy. Arthur decided that the best choice in this situation was to run away, so he told Sylvie to stay with Evian, and he himself would act as carefully as possible so as not to harm the test. At some point, he thought about cutting off these long arms of this monster. It turned out that he could protect himself, but he was not sure that after this test, everything would be okay. Well, anyway, he decided to give it a try and threw one of his charges straight into her heart. Of course, this caused a huge explosion, but thanks to this, the guy was finally able to see her body and the test itself, which was already incredible for him. After which, he only had to make a small alarm and catch the girl in the air so that she wouldn't fall and get hurt. The old man didn't know what exactly Arthur did or how it happened, but he was glad the guy was there anyway. For which he soon thanked him, saying that if it weren't for the guy, he would hardly have been able to save her from this torment. What if she was still alive during their conversation when she woke up and wanted to know why she was even on Earth and what had happened? But then she woke up and realized who was standing in front of her and what had possibly happened, and so at the first opportunity, she stood up and started running into his arms. The old man thought that she was running specifically towards him, so he put his hands out ready for this, but as it turned out a little later, the girl was definitely not hurrying towards him, but towards Arthur, who was standing behind the old man, and apparently he himself did not expect that the girl would actually run towards him. All he could think about at that moment was that his dear granddaughter had gone down the wrong path and had ruined not only his mood. She, in turn, was incredibly happy that her close friend Arthur had survived and was okay, because she was worried about him more than anyone else. At that moment, Arthur had no choice but to simply smile and say that he had actually managed to survive and that she was not imagining it. After this, they went to the nearest hospital, where the girl was successfully examined and a conclusion was made about her current condition. At that moment, Arthur still couldn't believe it and understand why the sphere that the old man from that store gave him merged with the test. Apparently it seemed that she returned to normal, but he was not sure whether it really helped her. So he decided that he simply had to go back to the store and ask him about what exactly he gave him. His thoughts were interrupted after a few minutes of rescue when one of the doctors approached them and wanted to inform them of Thesa's condition. According to the doctors, her vital signs were now normal, and there was nothing blocking the circulation of mana in her body. But no matter how good it sounded, the doctor still had one detail that confused them a little. After which the doctor started talking about how they had once mentioned that the test core was at the light orange stage, and that was exactly what he wanted to talk about. The smiles immediately disappeared from their faces, and Arthur, with a fearful voice, decided to notice whether everything was okay with her core. But the doctor gave a positive answer and said that he was not even a magician, but even he could not measure the level of her core, and this was already a big problem for them. The old man thought that this simply couldn't be happening, and that there must be some kind of mistake, so he decided to ask the doctors to double-check everything and find out once again exactly what was wrong. Then I realized that in any case, it would be best to do it myself, so I came closer to her and put my hand on her and began to examine her body myself. It didn't take more than a few seconds before the man started screaming that it was simply impossible, which scared Arthur and Sylvie, so they decided to ask him as quickly as possible what had happened and if everything was okay with her. After a short pause, the old man finally gave an answer, in which he said that she was not only fine, but that the core of the T's was now one step away from the dark silver stage, which would cause an incredibly strong surprise to everyone present in this room. Given this information, Arthur could assume that since she was almost at the silver stage, then perhaps they shouldn't leave her alone, to which the old man noted that in fact, everything was fine with her. She was just exhausted and therefore didn't feel very well. He also added that she just needed to be left alone so that she could rest properly after breaking through 3 stages, and when she woke up, he was going to take the castle from her right away. After which, Arthur finally made up his mind and spoke there, saying that he had been worried about one question for some time, after which he asked the old man if he could tell him a little more about the spears. The old man, in response to these words, turned to the guy and said in a quiet voice that Cinti had already told him about what had happened, and so he decided to clarify with the guy what exactly he wanted to know about them. Arthur wanted to know first of all how powerful this weapon was, because he understood perfectly well that to stop it at the silver stage, he would need about 20 mages in our solid yellow stage. But then the question arose, how many times does a mage's power increase when moving from silver to white Tanya? Then the old man began to tell him that he himself was a silver stage mage, and that it would take about 10 of his kind to hold back a solid white stage mage, and as for a light silver stage mage, it would take about 6 or 7 of his kind, like Cinti. Arthur didn't expect the old man to be so weak, because he thought he was one of the strongest mages on the continent, but considering his words about needing 10 like him, these thoughts quickly vanished from his mind. Hearing this, the old man immediately began to attack the guy and tell him that he was not actually a weakling and was a fairly strong magician. Well, even his skills would not be enough to defeat such an opponent. Having calmed down a bit, Arthur decided to ask how the magicians at the white stage of Stalin's core were so strong, since it turned out that some of the copies were so young that they were among the most powerful lower people on the entire continent. He also noted that he was even more interested in knowing what would happen to them after capturing the kingdoms, because if all the grievances were removed, he assumed that 6 copies would be enough to destroy the royal families. Then the old man told him that no one was offended, because in fact, the copies now received such power only because they had undergone the initiation rite. At least that's what the old man himself thought. Arthur didn't quite understand what was going on and asked the man to tell him more about it, so that he could get the hang of it. The man thought for a moment and then began to explain that this was a story about how royal families remained in power after the formation of the Union. Before he began the story itself, the man pointed out that only members of the royal families knew about this, and therefore he asked the boy to keep this information to himself and under no circumstances to tell it to anyone. After this warning, the old man asked the boy a question in which he wanted to know from him whether Arthur believed in gods. Before the boy could answer, the old man began to tell a story about how, during the era of beasts, elves, humans, and dwarves were nomads. They all traveled together only with members of their own race and only interacted with other races for the sake of trade. And although they had differences in culture and beliefs, they still remained on good terms. The 3 races would have lived peacefully to this day if not for the mana of the beasts that roamed the land freely and hunted them as prey. Over time, the number of 3 times began to decrease significantly, until one treasured day when God descended from the heavens and presented 3 times with artifacts with which it was possible to put an end to this era of problems. This God appeared before 3 leaders who were the distant ancestors of what are now called the royal families. These media were called Grider, Grayson, and Errol. God gave them 6 artifacts, which they divided among themselves. But the problem was that these artifacts were not meant for themselves. Instead, kings had to swear their souls to give them to their 2 strongest subjects and visit them with spears. In turn, the artifacts provided the knowledge that allowed them to use the powerful energy that surrounded them. And then the 3 kings gave the order to the 6 owners of the artifacts to spread their newly acquired knowledge and abilities, thereby training the most capable representatives of their times. Thus the first generation of magicians appeared, which became stronger and stronger with each passing year. Elves, humans, and dwarves banded together to push the beasts deeper into what is now called Beastland. Thus, on their land, the time of true peace did not hearken, which ended the era of beasts and marked the beginning of a new one, and then the 3 races peacefully dispersed. Each of them set out in search of a place that each of them could call home and that best suited their culture and lifestyle. The king of men led his people to the west, where there were plains with fertile soil. In his opinion, this was a truly suitable place that would promote rapid development. Alpha, in turn, led his people north, where they could live in harmony with the magical forest and the creatures that inhabited it. The dwarf king sent his people south, where the land was full of metal ores and precious stones. Because the kings and the copy looked after their people, a time of peace and prosperity came. While listening to this story, at some point Arthur interrupted the old man to ask him a question, the essence of which was that he wanted to know, or did he understand correctly that the copy was the first to use Anna thanks to the artifact? Although the old man didn't like the fact that the guy interrupted him, Arthur continued anyway and began to talk about how even considering how ancient this story is, its ending doesn't seem true. And what about the war between elves and humans? In that case, he doesn't understand at all where the copy went. All the old man could do in that case was grab the guy by the ears and start literally yelling at him, and then that something was wrong with the ending. But he didn't have time to finish it, because Arthur interrupted him. Although according to him, he had almost reached the truth and the war, which the guy so wanted to know as soon as possible. The old man didn't quite like it that the boy had already learned about the war, since in that case he would have to repeat himself, but he still started talking about how the truce lasted only a few generations until the people forgot about the union that united their ancestors, and greed in that case still did not get the better of them. As for the copies, they never went away. According to the old man, they continued to exist throughout all generations, and the royal families and pupils raised nearby were taught how to properly use each of the artifacts, so that this knowledge would not disappear at some point. The old man also did not forget to add that it was only because of the discovery of a new continent that they decided to combine the copies and reveal them to the public. Hearing this, Arthur could understand why all of this was kept secret, because even though the copy was bound to the kings by a soul oath, if this became known, the existing artifacts could simply disappear. Hearing these words, the old man began to say that then the fall of the delicate would most likely have occurred due to internal confusion. Arthur was a little upset, but in any case, he thanked the old man for telling him about all this, because for a long time he could not understand what was going on at all. But now that he learned about these details, everything became clear in his head. Then the old man hugged the boy and with a smile decided to tell him that apparently Arthur had finally grown from a brat into a real man, and that the ball would not make him happy. The old man was very happy that the boy's body had finally caught up in development with the uselessly mature brain he had had since their first meeting. Arthur tensed up a little at that moment, because he was really very worried about the fact that the old man had just been incredibly close to the real, true truth about him. As a friend, his thoughts were interrupted when the old man decided to point out to him that he had only told him all this because, in his opinion, Arthur was part of this whole story, and therefore he was obliged to know every detail. Arthur, in turn, did not quite understand what the old man was talking about, what this meant, so he decided to clarify this point with him and ask what exactly he meant. As it turns out, 3 speaks specifically about Arthur's beast, which, in his opinion, is far from simple. Moreover, if you believe the old man's words, then in his opinion, this beast is literally a god who can save the whole world in the future. Arthur, despite his beast, certainly didn't think so, because Sylvie was a bit like a small child who doesn't quite understand what's going on. Therefore, he once again decided to check with the old man whether he was sure of his words and whether he really meant this beast, to which the old man asked him not to rush and listen to him carefully. After which he collected his thoughts and began to talk about how the gods are not really what religious books make them out to be. To put it simply, they are beings who are able to rise above what they consider a mortal body and completely merge with their mother. Hearing these words, Arthur immediately thought that perhaps this was due to the fact that Sylvie was a dragon, and that was why she was very strong and smart. The old man immediately noticed that the guy was absolutely right, and it was not for nothing that they considered the meeting with the dragon a blessing, and for this reason, he kept the true form of the efforts a secret all this time. Arthur realized that he had been exposed and began to try to justify himself, but the old man immediately interrupted him and assured the guy that he did not really blame him and that he would have done the same thing himself if he had had such a chance. And the old man also wanted to add to the guy that regardless of whether Arthur believed him or not, he did not think that this was a simple coincidence and that she became a mana beast for no reason. According to the old man, the world is changing and therefore they must be prepared to face new problems. But in any case, he believed that Arthur would suffer the most if he did not prepare for this. So he asked the boy to think about it carefully when he had the opportunity to do everything possible to correct this issue. After this meeting, Arthur decided to take a stroll around the city to check on something that had been troubling him lately. The weather hadn't yet reached a dead end, and Sylvia felt it would be best to turn back, though Arthur didn't think so. Apparently, the whole thing was that Arthur noticed a small ball on the edge of this dead end, which attracted him with its light. He immediately reached for it and noticed that in addition to the ball, there was also some kind of paper there, which might have a small message. He read everything that was on this piece of paper and immediately went back home, throwing this ball up and smiling along the way. The next morning, he had a clearly bad mood on his face, so his friends decided to find out what happened to the guy and whether he had any problems. Arthur started laughing and assured her that everything was fine with him and that it was all because he was just thinking about his own affairs for a bit. Besides, if you believe his words, the breakfast was simply wonderful, and he really missed her cooking at the academy. This made the girl laugh even more because she only wanted to tell him that he ate very little, literally 1 or 2 pennies in all that time. After an awkward silence, the woman decided to tell Arthur that if he needed to do something, and he was worried about it, then they were ready to help him in this matter and do everything so that he would fulfill his mission. Arthur was a little doubtful of her words because he had promised that he would stay home until dawn, although the man intervened in the conversation and immediately assured the guy that there was no more life in him now than in Vincent after his important meetings, and in that case, he would be better off dealing with his normal son after he sorted out all his affairs. Besides, they say the most important thing for them is that he remains safe. The only thing they asked of him was that he return Sylvie safe and sound and that he not forget to take the gifts with him. Arthur was incredibly grateful to them for everything they did for him and smiled at every word they said. After some time, he collected the necessary things and was already standing on the threshold of his house, saying goodbye to his family and promising them that he would return soon. Kingrain's subjects were practically on their knees before him because it seemed to them that this simply had to be done, and without it, they would not succeed. The Queen repeated several times that this was extremely important for ensuring stability in their country, otherwise everything would be very sad. They also used the argument that in order to show the people of their country that he was the king who was ready to fight for them, he was obliged to show everyone that he was ready to destroy it. In other words, they literally told him that he had to destroy it, and then the whole world would understand that his country was not to be trifled with. Some time after leaving home, Arthur was not feeling in the best of health. His head was filled with all sorts of thoughts that did not allow him to live in peace. He was very worried about his owner, so I asked him several times if everything was okay, to which the guy replied with a smile that he had just had a bad dream and that, in fact, he was fine. In fact, for a long time, Arthur could not understand why this memory surfaced right now and what he had done, that his brain decided to generate it in his memory in this way. In any case, having sorted out his thoughts, he came to the conclusion that most likely this note was from the old man from the store, although he did not know how that old man heard their conversation, but apparently he knows what Very preferred to keep silent about. Well, the guy really didn't want to believe that Virion had told him everything he knew, because, as it seemed to Arthur, he had no need to hide anything from him. But on the other hand, he couldn't get the question out of his head, the essence of which was, who could know more about this than Virion himself? After some time, Arthur arrived at his destination, where he was met by a strange knight who asked the guy to state the purpose of his visit and provide proof of his identity, which caused considerable surprise in the guy, who did not think that he would have to provide and confirm his identity. According to the knight, these are the western lands where there are teleportation gates that lead to the kingdom of Eleanor, and therefore, he needs to confirm the guy's identity before letting him through. For Arthur, this was even more surprising, because he had absolutely no idea what this had to do with Eleanor or why it was like this. But he still stretched out his hand, in which lay an old and ancient watch, which, as it seemed to him, could easily serve as confirmation of his identity. No matter how it looked, it was actually the seal of the royal family of Eleanor, which shocked the knight, because then he decided to ask you a question. Who is this boy anyway? But right after that, he had to let you in, because he saw this signet ring. She simply had no right to do this, I don't know. After some time, Arthur continued his journey and entered a very huge gate, where he felt an incredibly strong energy on his body and immediately realized that the sensations were somehow different. At this moment, everything became even more sad, because his hands and body were literally tied up by someone with their energy and dragged far away, which could not help but frighten him. At that moment, Arthur saw for the first time how scared Sylvie was, because this had never happened before. He sincerely did not understand what was going on and who was to blame for this, as if a friend's eyes appeared before him, which were apparently the culprit of what was happening. A few seconds later, an incredibly strong earthquake began, And while Arthur was fighting for his existence along with the stronger, this voice continued to repeat that they were finally alone, and now they could calmly talk about everything. After some time, everything stopped, and Arthur was left alone with his pet, surrounded by white walls. After some time, the same cat that had disappeared from the Wind Soma store appeared in front of Arthur, and now he became very interested in finding out who she really was. A few seconds later, nothing was left of the cat, and it turned into a man, according to whom his friends called him Vinso, and for lower people like Arthur, he calls himself a god. Alduin and Mariel remained silent, while one of their colleagues shouted that they had no right to sit silently in this case and wait for everything to be decided for them, because in her opinion, one of their copies had died. At some point, they finally couldn't stand it, and shouted back at her that Dossier should calm down, and before doing anything, they should find out more information. After which, one of them decided to turn to Cindy and make sure that she was sure that the student who found Allie's body had not hidden anything from her. In response to this question, I heard only shouts and an even more angry atmosphere, because most of them believed that they should bring this student here, and after that, they will ask him to do as it should have been done from the very beginning. Although some people didn't agree with this idea, because they thought that there was no point in bringing that student, because he could embellish the events to make himself look like a hero. Besides, Cynthia had already interrogated him and been to that dungeon, which meant that calling that guy simply didn't make any difference. Over time, they decided that the course of action had already been determined, and all they needed now was to send their best Pathfinder mages to see if they could find any remaining clues there. So one of them decided to ask Cindy if she could join them. She watched and listened to all their conversations with a smile while thinking about her own, but when they approached her with a clear question, she immediately gave her answer, saying that, unfortunately, she had more urgent matters that required her presence, so she was forcing them to refuse. These words could not help but anger one of those participating in this meeting, who believed that nothing could be more important than this expedition. Although not everyone thought so, and many said that Cindy had already done more than enough for the council, so they were when to thank her for her help and say that she could return back to the academy. That same evening, Cynthia returned to the academy and talked to herself. Who wanted to know about the woman? Why she was so absent-minded on such a mission? The woman replied that she was simply wondering if it was right to tell the council that the students who found the alley were Arthur. The owl agreed with her, because it also seemed to her that this boy himself was a mystery, which was not as easy to solve as they might think, although on the other hand, she believed that nothing good would happen if the council began to suspect him. In any case, they came to the same conclusion that they were lucky that he didn't see anything while he was down there. As a friend, my thoughts were interrupted when someone shot a lightning bolt at her, taking her by surprise and not even giving her the opportunity to recover from this unexpected blow. Having taken the blow, the woman immediately realized that there was more than one spellcaster or mage around her, so she would have to try hard to win this battle, or at least stay alive. In any case, she was not going to give up so easily, so as soon as the enemies appeared, she used her magic and began to fight them. Her attackers thought that this would be too easy a battle for them, so they attacked her without any hesitation. But after a few minutes, after the woman activated her magic, she was able to deal them a fairly serious counterattack. When everything was clear, the woman asked her owl to finish off these guys once and for all. One of them, even before his death, did not stop smiling and said that he was not heard by the woman, and now it seems to him that life here was kind to her, and she was a little lucky. If luck had been on their side, then it would have been far from clear how it would have ended in reality. In response to his words, Sibley immediately told him that if he suggested saying such words, his core would not last long, and if he told about their plans, then she would certainly give him a quick death. This caused the man to laugh incredibly hard, to which he replied that if she thought he would tell her anything, then she was deeply mistaken, and all this was because he considered her a traitor who had made a huge mistake. After which he shouted that they were in any case gaining their former strength. If she thought that this continent still had decades ahead, then she was deeply mistaken. because according to him, they have spies in every corner from the forest to the coast. The inhabitants of Deacon have only a couple of measly years before the war begins. She didn't listen to the end, and as soon as he started shouting such things, she used her magic and finished off his core from the inside. After which, she thanked Ara for cleaning up all this mess, to which her magical beast replied that it was not as problematic as she thought. Besides, the meat of several of these people was not bad, and he even liked it. Her pet immediately wanted to know from the woman what about her wound on her back, to which the woman answered freshly that she was fine, but the only thing that bothered her was that she could not get rid of the feeling that it was too easy. In any case, there was no point in thinking about it, so she decided that they now needed to go to the coast. And before they do this, she decided to pour a small amount of elixir on her wound, which was supposed to help her revive this wound, and she also suggested to forget about all her suspicions and think that they are simply in vain. At this time, Arthur was talking with the same guy who called himself a god, and according to him, it seemed to him that this form of communication would be the most suitable for their conversation, which made Arthur think that a creature that is much stronger than a magician at the white stage of the core is very dangerous. But on the other hand, Arthur understood that now was definitely not the time to panic, and so he literally forced himself to pull himself together, and the most important thing was not to remain silent, but to do everything possible so that this pseudo would think that he was afraid of him. Therefore, Arthur immediately decided to tell him that before they continued the conversation, he needed to at least clarify something, and without that, he was not going to talk to him at all. So the guy started talking about how the guard told him that this was a teleportation gate that led to the kingdom of Eleanor, and that's why he wanted to know if something happened to Taija or the wine, or if it was somehow connected to the sphere that they gave him. The answer to these questions, with wine, told the guy that he just needed to somehow make sure that Arthur would be able to get through them. And after these words, he created a small illusion, in which the princess and the previous king of the elves were visible, who, apparently, were in perfect order. At least this is the illusion that Vincent created. He also couldn't help but add that the princess was now even more than just fine, because according to him, thanks to the pearl elixir that he so generously shared with her, her core did not explode. All that Vincent asked Arthur was to kill himself in the fact that he was destined specifically for him. This surprised Arthur, because he didn't fully understand what this guy was talking about and what had exploded there. But apparently Vincent didn't care at all about what Arthur was asking him, because he continued to say that now they should talk about why he brought the guy here. After which he told Arthur that he was a resident of Dicathan, and it was no longer a secret that Dicathan was not the only continent in this world. According to him, Dicathan was always ruled by those who lived in the lands of Epheotus, and although they were inferior, they still considered them as gods and called themselves Asuras. Arthur listened attentively to what this strange man was telling him and tried to sincerely understand what Epheotus and Alacria had to do with it, when suddenly a realization came to him and he decided to ask Vincent, or did the gods who gave them the artifacts not teach them magic? Vincent smiled, although you couldn't tell from his face, but in any case, this smile was connected with the fact that the guy was absolutely right, and that was exactly what he wanted to convey to him. After which he told the guy that now he knows about the artifact only thanks to the old elf king, who told him about them. But in his lands, almost no one knows the whole truth about the Asuras. After all, if you think about it, the Asuras have always been guided by a kind of noble obligation, and they never directly interfered in the affairs of their continent, only if peace or balance was under threat. But this immutable rule was once violated. After all, Epheotus was once divided into 3 factions, which consisted of many clans of different races. The heads of these clans of each faction have their own interests. But they all agree that they should not interfere in the lives of the lower classes. However, after Agrona became the new head of the Vritra clan, he decided to break this law in order to gain more benefits for his people. Finally, Arthur heard what Vritra was. All this time, it was the name of the clan. Vincent also convinced the guy that he was aware that the guy had met several members of this clan, but what he was sure of was that the Vritra clan was an anomaly, even among the Asura. But he asked the boy to think of them as scientists, because they were constantly studying and refining their understanding of how mana worked. They especially improved this skill when Agron came to power. At that moment, Vritra's strength increased significantly, and later they learned that he and his clan members were conducting experiments on the bodies of the lower classes in Alakria, trying to find various ways to strengthen their own abilities. Arthur heard about this and was immediately disappointed, because he thought it was simply terrible and unthinkable. But he also didn't understand what this had to do with him, and why Vincent was even telling him about this. The man, in response to the boy's question, said that he was absolutely right, and in fact, this should not concern Arthur in any way, but now, because of his connection with them, in Vincent's opinion, Arthur should be much more careful. And immediately after these words, he used some strange magic, which he directed at Arthur. It was so powerful that at one point the guy even found it difficult to move. And after a few more seconds, he noticed behind him the huge monster that Sylvia had turned into. As soon as the boy came to his senses, Vincent continued to speak, and according to him, they had been searching for Lady Sylvia for many years, but when they finally found her traces of mana, they led them to a little boy who held God in his hands. In other words, Vincent wanted to tell the boy that Arthur was currently connected with the child of Master Vincent's only daughter, and the granddaughter of the most powerful creature that ever inhabited this world. And at that moment, it dawned on Arthur that in fact, everything Virion had said was true, and in fact, dragons were gods, and Grandmother Sylvia and Sylvie were among the most powerful among them. Vincent also added that if you take into account their lineage and potential, then this information is more than true, and also according to him, most gods have 3 forms. But it seems to him that Lady Sylvie remained in that miniature form so as not to waste her energy, although most Asura are in humanoid form for this purpose. This was the first time Arthur had heard of this, so he asked the man to explain in more detail what he meant, and he explained that if Sylvie had not transformed into her humanoid form before, then most likely she was simply not capable of it now. In other words, he wanted to say that Lady Sylvie's mana core was still underdeveloped, and given the overall situation, they had discovered signs of Agron's spies on this continent. And if this turns out to be true, then a war could soon begin, and although the upper crust of Epheotis will never accept this due to their pride, Arthur's connection with Lady Sylvie could play a key role in it. And so, Vincent wanted to tell Arthur that as long as he was willing to remain their ally, there was no need for them to separate him from Lady Sylvie. Hearing these words, Arthur immediately understood that if he did not help them, they would take Sylvie away from him. So after thinking for a bit, he replied that this war would affect his continent, and therefore his family and friends. So he would become their ally under any circumstances, and this meant that they wanted to know if the guy was ready to become their obedient pawn. Vincent did not expect the guy to speak so straightforwardly, so he smiled and noted that Arthur was quite perceptive for his age, and the guy's core was quite well developed. But still, according to him, as soon as Arthur and Lady Sylvie arrived in Epheotis, they would be able to train him properly. Arthur did not listen to Vincent until the end, and as soon as he heard that they would need to go to Epheotis, he immediately shouted about it in surprise. Vincent didn't understand the guy's reaction, but he still noted once again that it was simply necessary, because according to him, the power of Lady Sylvia was sealed inside the guy, for which even the Asuras were ready to destroy, but he couldn't even really use it, and Epheotis was the only place where he could be taught this. This way, he and Lady Sylvie will be able to become much stronger, and only in this case will Dicathan have a chance to resist the magicians of Alakria. The girl, sitting at the meeting, thought about the fact that less than 2 days had passed since Claire and Curtis returned from the excursion, but due to the increasing frequency of hate crimes, they had not even had time to properly rest. Meanwhile, Curtis was proving to everyone else that they had beaten Denton and tied him to a statue that was right next to their building, and the main reason for this was that he was supposedly not a human, but an elf. That's why she wanted to convey to them that they simply had to stop this radical group before they became even more active. She realized that her brother had not said a word after he told her about what had happened in the dungeon and how he and Claire had to leave Arthur. In the meantime, they wanted to know if there was any progress, because until they had at least some evidence, the professors would not help them, because they were too busy trying to please the sponsors. One of them said that he was able to catch only a few people who were nearby, but they have nothing to charge them with, and he is now closely watching Charles. But if they accuse him of something without evidence, it will not be very good. This started to anger them, because they didn't understand what the purpose of a disciplinary committee was if they weren't even capable of dealing with this kind of problem. Curtis, in response to these words, assured them that they only needed to wait for Director Goodsky. They couldn't believe that they were doing this only because they didn't like the direction the academy was going, and who would have thought that Arthur would be the trigger for them. After these words, there was nothing but silence in the hall. Everyone was lost in their own thoughts and could not believe that they had come to this. All these thoughts made the girl jump up from her chair at one point and shout about the fact that Arthur became a professor despite his humble origins. And all this once again proves that he is very talented, so she believed that they had no reason to use this as a pretext for such conversations. They interrupted Princess Catelyn and assured her that they understood and knew this perfectly well. Moreover, one of them assured her that he also despised them for using his rival as an excuse. After which Curtis added that, in fact, they just don't know what to do next, so through such conversations, they are trying to find a solution to this problem. Catelyn was very angry, and a little more, and she would definitely start crying, because she was more than sure that if Arthur were here, he would definitely come up with something. They fell silent immediately after these words, and then added to her that, in fact, they cannot drag Arthur into these matters, because then everything will change dramatically. Catelyn thought that this was complete nonsense, because in her opinion he should return soon, and they simply had to tell him all this. Suddenly their conversation was interrupted by some guy whom Ketris had already seen somewhere, and if he was not mistaken, then this was Arthur's friend. This guy confirmed this information, and then asked them for forgiveness for interrupting their meeting, but according to him, he simply did not know when they would gather next time, so he decided to come in right now. He did all this just to tell them something very interesting about Arthur. But suddenly, his speech was interrupted when an unexpected earthquake began in the meeting room, which silenced each of them. Having come to their senses, they began to run out of the room one after another and head for the exit, because they understood perfectly well that this earthquake was definitely not a good sign, and they needed to get out of this house immediately. Catelyn knew very well that the topic of equality had always been very important to her mother, because she clearly remembers that as a child, she refused to study with other students, because they were not princesses like Catelyn. She still has a vivid image of her mother telling the girl that she understood her perfectly, and therefore believed that the girl had done nothing wrong, but she also believed that Catelyn should not shun other children just because they were not princesses. She constantly told her that she really wanted the girl to understand that she was first and foremost a person, and only then a princess, and it didn't matter at all if the person was a king or queen, a servant, a powerful magician, an elf, or a dwarf. In any case, they are all different in some way, but first of all, each of them is an individual, and that is why she always taught her daughter never to despise someone for something they cannot and do not want to change in themselves. Catelyn's mother was always reasonable and smart because she always cared about everyone. She always scolded her and her brother for the discrimination they showed out of ignorance. She has been pushing for a long time to have a building built inside the campus that would serve as both a museum and a monument to the union of the three races. Unity Hall was supposed to be a symbol of peace and culture, and no one could have imagined that it would one day become a target. Be that as it may, they immediately began to clear away the rubble that had been created by the attack, and they did all this only because there were still students inside who needed to be urgently rescued. Some people cleared the rubble, while others used their animals to transport the wounded to the hospital so that they could receive help as quickly as possible. The first thing they did was try to put out the flames, and they started doing this from the left side of the building in order to prevent further fire. Immediately after they managed to put out the fire, Catelyn took off and started running at full speed towards Charles, who did not even suspect that he could be identified. He tried to hide and run away, but to his great regret, he did not succeed in doing so, because he was captured even before he had come up with an escape plan. They immediately came closer to him and immediately told Charles to stop messing with their heads immediately. Besides, they had been wanting to ask him some questions for a long time. Charles immediately began to panic and look around, and also ask for help from the people who were around, but no one wanted to help him because they all considered him a bad person. Suddenly, these threats were interrupted by a voice coming from behind the guys. The man who approached them wanted to know first of all what was going on here. It was one of the professors who spoke with confidence that now was not the best time for conflicts with students, and he believed that they should immediately stop this disorder. Charles thought that this was his chance, which he should definitely take advantage of, and so he began to shout at the professor that these students had attacked him without any reason and that he did not understand at all what was going on here and who they were. He also dared to say that he almost died in that explosion, and after what he experienced, they suddenly attacked him, and he was just an innocent victim, which could not help but anger the guys even more. This angered Theodore more than anyone else, so he shouted that Charles had already been caught more than once in the company of members of a radical group, and now he was hanging around near the crime scene with his insignificant friends and wanted to convince everyone around him that he was innocent. The professor immediately interrupted Theodore's speech and assured the boy that apparently the members of the disciplinary committee had nothing better to do than make baseless accusations against students. Another professor intervened in this conversation, trying to calm her colleague, who had already attacked Theodore because the boy was groundlessly accusing his classmate. After which she turned to Theodore and told him that she understood him perfectly well, that he was in a stressful situation, but she also believed that without evidence, he could not hold the students accountable, and therefore it seemed to her that now was not the time for hasty conclusions. At this point, other students began to actively discuss the fact that the disciplinary committee does whatever it wants, and, in general, it seemed to them that if the professor had not intervened, then no one would have stopped their attack on that student. This made Caitlin even more angry until she was stopped by Curtis, who with just a look and a touch of his hand made her understand that it was not worth it, and that she would be better off calming down. Curtis also didn't forget to turn to Theodore, whom he told that he should listen to Professor Glory, because he believed that now was the best time to set their priorities correctly, and besides, it would be a good idea for them to make sure that no one was left in the building. Theodore decided to listen to his friend and therefore threw Charles back a few meters, where he was caught by other students. Everyone around him considered Charles a victim, but as soon as he was in the arms of his friends, his sly smile did not take long to appear, and while he had every right to do so, because he believed that everything was going according to his plan. Meanwhile, Arthur's friend tried to train as much and as hard as possible. He believed that he would succeed if he did it every day. But in any case, over time, he came to the conclusion that controlling the shape of the Earth is quite easy, but he has difficulty controlling the trajectory, although he was able to reach the light orange stage of the core. But he still had a lot to learn. At times, he even felt a little angry that his gift required too much. He spent so much time on all this, and it did not bring as much benefit as he would have liked, so he thought that perhaps he should tell Arthur about this so that he could help him with his training. In his head, he was thinking about a mage with an affinity for the 4 elements, with a core at a solid yellow stage, and also with the will of a dragon. All of this made him think that if Arthur were at the academy, then most likely he would be able to cope with the flames alone. As soon as the boys found out that Arthur was okay, they immediately rejoiced, because they always knew that he could cope with such difficulties. After which they decided that in that case, they should sort out their fiasco before he returned. But now, sitting in the forest, the guy couldn't help but think about what the guys would do if they found out about his real abilities. He was interested to know if they would worry about him. He found the answer to this question quite quickly. He immediately noted for himself that in any case, they would be worried about him. Moreover, he assumed that with his skills and strength, he would become popular. But even so, he has people who are sincerely worried about him, such as Princess Tessia and the guys from the disciplinary committee. He always wanted to know if he would have had such a childhood if he had not grown up with the dwarves, because they were both mistakes of nature. The only difference between them was that Arthur only benefited from all this. He tried to push these thoughts out of his head because he, like no one else, understood that Arthur had always actually protected him, and now he simply had to take part in a more serious battle. And for now, he needed to focus on himself and train properly. And if he wants to stand on an equal footing with him, then he must work on himself literally every day so that it becomes difficult to stand. The mercenaries were already tired of standing in front of the gate and waiting. They wanted to find out as quickly as possible how much longer they had to hang around here, because if this continued, at this rate they would be lucky if they got inside before the end of the day. But some thought they should simply be glad that, thanks to the council, they were allowed to do business here again. At that moment, Arthur passed by and one of the mercenaries turned his attention to the guy. It seemed to him that the guy shouldn't pass by like that out of turn. That's why he immediately ran up to him and grabbed him by the shoulder. Arthur, in turn, turned around and calmly asked the man a question, in which he wanted to know how he could help him. At that moment, the man, looking at the guy, thought only about the fact that he wasn't even an elf, but still allowed himself to do such things. And after a few more seconds, he started yelling at Arthur and telling him that maybe the guy was blind or something like that. But he would still tell him that there was a line behind him at the entrance, and they definitely didn't have the right to walk past like that. The girl who was with Arthur immediately stood up for Arthur, and she wanted to tell this man that the guy was Eleanor's guest and he had urgent business with him. But apparently the mercenary did not care at all about this, and before she could finish speaking, he hit her. At that moment, another mercenary approached them and asked Roger to calm down and not touch these guys. But Roger apparently was not going to just leave them, because he believed that they were not Eleanor's official guests, and besides, they were also here on urgent business. And so he came here to find out why this puppy suddenly decided that he shouldn't stand in the line in which they have to stand for hours. Arthur continued to answer calmly and quite politely, although there were already many reasons to start being rude in response, but still he said in a calm voice that he obviously had a good reason not to do this. These words made the mercenary smile, and then he said that apparently the boy's father didn't beat him with a belt enough as a child, since he allows himself to speak in such a tone. So he decided to teach the guy a lesson and lifted him off the ground, and then showed with his whole appearance that he intended to use his power. Besides, according to him, he controls fire well enough, so he can burn the guy at any moment if he does not decide to ask for forgiveness. Arthur was tired of putting up with this, so at some point he decided to use a piece of his power to show the man that he needed to change his mind and start acting differently. Otherwise, over time, he would definitely regret what he did. Besides, if Roger suddenly decides to go into battle with the guy, then, according to Arthur, he will need to use a power similar to that which Arthur has. Otherwise, he simply will not have the slightest chance. It was clear from Roger's expression that he had clearly changed his mind, and now he definitely did not want to engage in a fight with the guy, especially after he had shown what he was capable of. Arthur saw this immediately, so he turned around and simply continued on his way, because he understood perfectly well that they were definitely not his rivals, and bragging about his strength in front of them simply did not make any sense. A few minutes later, they were already inside and enjoying the view. There were quite a lot of people there, and they were all of different kinds. At that moment, Arthur thought about how he had spoken with Vincent. Then after their conversation, the guy confidently stated that if they were looking for Sylvie so persistently, then he wanted to know why it took them so long to find them. Did his beast will not carry the unique imprint of Sylvie's mana? According to Vincent, by hiding the mark of his connection with one of Lady Sylvia's feathers, he also hid the imprint of her mana from them. But now that they had finally found him, they assured him that it was now time to actively prepare for the trip to Epheotis. It was to this place that Arthur arrived accompanied. Soon a completely new life would begin for him, in which he would perform a very important function. Approaching closer to Epheotis itself, the guys were met by security, who wished them good morning and wanted to know who they were and what they needed here. In response to their question, Arthur extended his hand, which contained a piece of that very invitation that the guards should recognize and immediately let the guy inside. But the reaction slightly surprised Arthur, because they continued to stand with surprised faces and after a few more seconds, one of them even asked how they could be sure of the authenticity of this medallion. At that moment, Arthur wanted to know the answer to only one question, which was why he was even giving this sign if no one believed that it was real. Suddenly his thoughts were interrupted when one of the guards turned to Arthur with a smile and allowed him to pass. Suddenly their dialogue was interrupted again because a strong earthquake began, which began for unknown reasons. The royal guards immediately began shouting at the guy and his girlfriend to step back immediately, otherwise they might get hit. At that moment, Arthur thought that he was pleased to see that the royal guards were not bad guys, but just annoying. But suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted again when he heard a familiar voice telling the guy that he was very glad to see him again after so much time. As soon as the smoke cleared, he saw an old man in front of him who could barely cough, and as soon as this happened, the guy immediately wanted to know from him what happened and whether an intruder had really broken in, although the old man immediately assured the guy that there was no way an intruder could have caused so much harm. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by the same girl who came with Arthur, and she screamed that she was not able to continue to control them, so she was forced to ask them for help. The old man immediately began to say that, although he was not sure, but apparently her body somehow completely merged with the will of the guardian of the ancient forest, which could not help but surprise Arthur because he did not understand how she was able to reach such a level, and even with the will of an S-rank beast. In his mind, he began to think that perhaps it was all about the pearl elixir that she had received from Winsome. The old man interrupted his thoughts when he began to say that even though Tessia was awake and aware of everything, she could not control the power, and the more he cut them off, the more they grew back. The man said all this in order to finally tell the guy that perhaps it would be better if he tried to do it instead of him, and he, in turn, would cover for him. The guards arrived at that moment to help, and first of all, wanted to ask the gentleman how they could help him, to which he confidently replied that they would only get in the way here, so he asked them to simply clear the area and make sure that no one came near. Even after hearing these words, they couldn't quite believe their ears, so they began to insist on their help and at least get the boy out of here, to which the old man responded with a shout because he believed that he had clearly made it clear to them that they had to get out of here. But Arthur would stay. After the guards began to leave, the old man began to talk about how the fewer people knew about Tessia, the better. And now that they had done everything as needed, the old man suggested that the guy finally begin what they had been preparing for so long. Sylvie was listening to them attentively at that moment and looking at Arthur, and when they were about to act, she decided to offer her help. But Arthur gently told her that they didn't want to scare the locals with the dragon, so if something emergency happened, he would definitely call her. But for now, he could handle it himself. At least that's what it seemed like to him at first glance, until he had to dodge a blow from his opponent, who was quite strong and fast. On the other hand, he quickly realized that it would be too risky to use fire spells here, and he would have to come up with something completely different. After some time, Arthur finally came to the understanding of what he must do next, so he shouted at Tess that she should try to make sure that the vines do not wrap around her, and then he himself would take action. Tess, in turn, could not believe her eyes that she really saw Arthur in front of her. But in any case, there was no time for these thoughts, so she began to fulfill the guy's request, and also immediately asked him to hurry because, according to her, she would not be able to hold back for long. He decided that the best solution in this situation would be to simply get as close to her as possible and assure the girl that everything would be fine and she shouldn't worry so much. The guy slowly approached her closer and closer, and after some time he was finally able to get as close as possible, hug her, and say that he was there, and now she would definitely not be in any danger. Thanks to the fact that the girl was able to calm down and come to her senses, Arthur was able to carefully lower her to the ground and end all the chaos that was happening around her. After this madness, the guy returned to his normal appearance, and the first thing he asked the girl was a question in which he wanted to know how she was feeling. Tess sighed in response and quietly said that she hated that she constantly needed his help. Arthur immediately took her by the shoulders and assured the girl that in fact it was not her fault, because if anyone was to be blamed, it was only him for giving her this will of the beast. But she definitely didn't agree with him on this, because she believed that it wasn't his fault that he gave her the opportunity to grow. And now she promised herself that she had to learn to use this power to fight shoulder to shoulder with him. This could only make the guy smile. He was incredibly happy that the girl had made exactly this decision, and that instead of thinking about giving up everything, she had thoughts like this, where she had to win no matter what. So in this case, apart from support, he could not provide her with anything else, and therefore told her that he would simply wait for this. At this moment, Vincent was actively watching all of this and thinking that it was too early to tell Arthur about everything. But one day, as it seemed to him, this boy would have to learn everything about Lady Sylvie, and it was far from certain that he would be able to accept this truth, especially the truth about the family tree. The conversation between Arthur and Tess was interrupted at one point by the old man, who until the very end did not want to disturb the idyll between them. But he still had to do it, because he wanted them to think together about those who would have to clear the rubble they had created after this small battle. The guys looked at each other and realized that this was clearly not part of their plans. However, Arthur was interested in another question, in which he wanted to know where they should go now and what the old man was talking about. The man was apparently expecting this question, so as soon as the guy asked him, he immediately answered with a smile that their next stop was a place that wasn't in pieces. While they were driving, Tess fell asleep, and Arthur actively talked to the old man about how, in fact, it was primarily his fault, because it was he who supported Tess when she wanted to release the beast stage from her body. Then they decided together that since the will had merged with the body, she would be able to control it. The old man listened attentively to the guy, and at one point told him that he thought that in an extreme case, he would be able to keep the situation under control, but it turned out that he was far from capable of this. The guy, hearing these words, thought that since the process of assimilating the will of the beast had accelerated, Tess most likely missed the training stage, which is why until today she had not had the chance to find out how difficult it would be to control the will. And looking at the girl, he quite clearly felt that her will of the beast was different from his will. Even though she had completely merged with Tess's body, he still had the feeling that her will was fighting with her mana. So he came to the conclusion that the girl clearly needed to be more careful, because it could be dangerous for her and for everyone in the area if something like this happened again. The old man was angered by the boy's words, so he began to yell at him and say that he himself now understands this perfectly well, because he is just a grandfather who was slightly excited and proud of his granddaughter's progress, so he allowed her to take such a step. After he calmed down a bit, he suggested that perhaps the best solution was a seal that would suppress the mana until Tess's control over that power improved. But if something happened and she didn't manage to remove it in time, she would be left defenseless. So he suggested that perhaps she should start by looking for a protective artifact for her. Arthur accepted this proposal with a smile, because he believed that a protective artifact would be a good solution, and he also added that if this would calm the grandfather, then the guy was ready to stay close to his precious granddaughter for as long as possible. The old man was pleased by these words, although in fact all this time he had no doubt that this would be so. But then he became serious enough again and told the guy that he understood perfectly well that he often made fun of him and Tess, but now he wanted to know their real plans for the future. And to make it easier for Arthur, the old man clarified that he was currently asking whether he would like to marry her. This was quite an unexpected question for Arthur, so he needed a little time to find an answer. But before he could say a word, the old man interrupted him again and began to say that he really meant that Tess was a little sad and that he and his parents could spoil her a little. But in any case, he thought that she was a pretty good girl, and besides, they had a long history. This sounded a little strange to Arthur, because he always thought that, as a rule, elves start dating and marrying much later. For the old man, traditions were the least important thing, because given the speed with which Decatan is changing, whoever they are, they must in any case keep up with the times. And besides, at the moment, he would like to first find out from the guy if he has feelings for his granddaughter. Arthur didn't think long about his answer, and almost immediately declared that he had feelings, and although right now he couldn't figure out exactly what he was feeling, sympathy or love, In his opinion, he could only hope that with time he would be able to find the answer to this question. Until he can do that, he'd like to better himself before even thinking about asking for his granddaughter's hand in marriage. The old man said with a smile that this was indeed a worthy answer, and now he was more than sure that the guy had a good head on his shoulders for a reason. At that moment, Sylvie was listening attentively to the conversation between Arthur and the old man, and therefore at one point she nevertheless noticed that she always knew that Arthur liked Tess. Arthur began to worry that Tess might hear all this, but the old man assured the guy that there was no need to worry about it because no matter what, Tess would sleep. Although in fact, Tess heard everything, and at that moment she did everything so that no one would find out about it. But mentally, she could not believe that Arthur had nevertheless admitted that he liked her. She also understood perfectly well that her breathing at that moment had become too rapid, and she urgently needed to try to calm down. And here she was right, because Arthur and the old man immediately noticed this, and they could not understand why the girl began to sweat so much, but assumed that she was having nightmares. After some time, Arthur, during this trip, thought about the fact that the concern with which he treats Tess is different from what he feels for anyone else. But the most he can do now is protect her, because the fact that Ellie and Mom have pendants of rebirth calms him down a lot. But he still didn't forget that this was only a one-time spell, and Ellie hadn't fully awakened yet. And so, if Winsome didn't lie about the impending war, then he simply has to find a mana beast for Ellie as soon as possible. He believed that this beast should be large and strong enough to protect her if necessary, and if the beast could protect Ellie's life, then it would definitely be able to protect her from the weak-willed boys who were trying to hit on her. All these thoughts once again convinced him that he definitely had to find his little sister a pet that would be able to tear to shreds any boy who decided to come closer than 3 steps to her, when suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by an old man who told Arthur that they had already arrived and it was time for him to stop smiling like that. Tess had already come to her senses by this time, and as soon as she got out of the carriage, she immediately saw her parents, to whom she quickly went to hug them because she missed them so much. Arthur, in turn, did not quite understand where they were and what kind of place this was. Suddenly his thoughts were interrupted when he heard his name from Tess's father, who declared that he was very glad to see the boy again. Arthur came a little closer, and then the girl's father added that he had a feeling that as soon as something happened to their daughter, he immediately appeared, for which they did not even know how to thank him. But even so, they both would like to hear the reason why they had to change their route home and why they were told that their palace was under renovation. The old man and Arthur smiled a little but said nothing. But Tess's parents, after a few seconds, began to laugh and joke about how it was most likely their daughter who was having a little fun. Tess felt a little embarrassed when they started saying things like that to her, because she was ashamed of what had happened. They realized that they had gone a bit too far, so they immediately stopped and began to convince her that she really had nothing to worry about, because everything was not as bad as she might think. The old man also intervened in the conversation and began to say that he was training with Tess, and while he was in his first stage, he got a little carried away and destroyed one of the parts of the palace, which was not quite true, and Arthur understood this perfectly well. The man immediately noticed the doubt in Arthur's eyes, so immediately after his words, he looked into his eyes and with just one glance made the guy understand that he needed to be quieter. Arthur understood him and was not going to contradict the man, so after a few seconds he noticed that everything was exactly like that, and the old man was definitely telling the truth. The man was glad that Arthur understood him so quickly, so he immediately added that the house would be quickly repaired. Moreover, it seemed to him that they would not even have time to notice. Besides, there was a mess in the palace, because of which it could be a little uncomfortable there. And also, they were already quite late for Rinny, so he suggested ending their dialogue there. Tess completely agreed with him, because she also noticed that they had not seen Grandma Rinia for a long time, and therefore she was very interested to know if everything was okay with her. The man thought for a moment, and answered his granddaughter, saying that in fact everything was fine with Rinia. She was just busy, so she couldn't always get in touch with them. He also said that she had said several times that she was very interested in Arthur's future. Arthur decided to say that he was curious about why she was interested in him in general, but where exactly was Elder Rinia? Besides, if he wasn't mistaken, her house looked a little different from last time, to which Tess's mother gave him a rather logical answer, saying that quite a lot of time had passed since last time, and since Rinia moved in, none of them had had the chance to meet her. They also told him that she had decided to live in isolation, somewhere on the edge of the kingdom. She did not give the reason for this decision, but the last time the old man came to her, he almost died because of the traps and protective spells that were set up around the house, and at least this time he warned her. But he still asked them to be extremely careful, because if you think logically, if she has such precautions, then there are those whom she is wary of. It was very interesting, and that's why Arthur immediately wondered what exactly Elder Rinia was trying to protect himself from. During this short trip, Tess's father decided to tell Arthur that his mana beast continued to intrigue him, something with which Arthur himself could not help but agree. According to the man, he realized that he still had not had the chance to thank the guy and Sylvie properly, although Arthur himself believed that there was nothing to thank him for. The man certainly didn't think so, because in his opinion, the guy treated his daughter very well, and from what he heard, it was thanks to Arthur that Tess managed to avoid some dangerous situations. Arthur still thought that it was nothing, because according to him, Tess also helped him, which was quite unexpected for the man, so he decided to ask the guy what exactly she did. After this question, Arthur began to talk about how at times, only thanks to her, he managed to remain sane. This was not quite what the man expected to hear, and he said it right to the guy's face, and then laughed and said that these words were a little difficult to hear from a 13-year-old child. And by doing so, he wanted to say that he could not do anything about the fact that he saw an adult in him. At first, the guy got a little nervous when he heard these words, but then he realized that it was actually a compliment, for which he thanked the man. Immediately after this, the man turned to the guy and assured him that, in fact, he definitely shouldn't take this as a compliment, because it was simply the truth that they shouldn't forget. After all, as a father, he can confidently say that no parent would want to see their child grow up too quickly, let alone have to bear the burden that adults should have shouldered. However, looking at his daughter, he often thought that his youth had ended about 30 years ago. And immediately after these thoughts, he declared that, in fact, the council was formed only thanks to Arthur, which could not help but surprise the guy. The man confirmed this once again, and then added that he would be honest if he said that after the war, he did not have the best opinion of people. After all, during that difficult time, due to a huge number of circumstances, he unfortunately lost his mother. And during all this time, he could not find the strength to forgive them for this. But just recently, he had to experience an even worse picture when he almost lost his daughter after slave traders invaded their forest. And then came a human child who returned his daughter safe and sound and had the courage not only to save her from the slavers, but also to scold the elven king. The lecture given to him by a human child became the very impetus to change his views that he so needed. In any case, now Tess's father believes that no matter what, he just wants the guy to know that if Arthur decides to become part of their family, he will not be against it. When suddenly their conversation was interrupted by Tess's mother to say that perhaps from the outside, one could say that the man was acting calmly, but she was more than sure that he had long wanted to meet Arthur again. These words made both the man and Arthur himself think quite a lot. But she certainly wasn't going to stop there, so she added that if he really wanted their dialogue to be private, then they should have created a wind barrier. Because to her it looked like they wanted to be heard and even spoke louder than usual at times. After these words, they began to smile because they realized that the woman was actually right, and they really forgot about control and began to speak as loudly as possible. But suddenly their dialogue was interrupted by an old man who raised his hand and in a rather serious voice asked them all to be quieter and stop immediately because he heard something strange. They immediately listened to him and also decided to focus on the place where they were, and as soon as they did this, they immediately heard screams that came from nowhere. Suddenly, after a strange silence, they heard a strange rustling sound from the bushes, which became louder and louder with each passing second, which made the boys tense up quite a bit. Well, after a few more moments, they saw in front of them the terrible face of a woman who looked as creepy as possible. Arthur didn't think for long, so as soon as he had the opportunity, he went into battle and was ready to destroy her. But at the last moment, he was stopped by an old man who did not allow the guy to strike, because he realized in time that this was not a monster, but the same grandmother to whom they had been heading for so long. In any case, they all got off with a slight fright, especially the old woman, who certainly did not expect such a turn of events. When she calmed down a bit and came to her senses, she immediately started yelling at the guy and telling him that she absolutely did not understand what he wanted to achieve when he decided to attack the old woman, and besides, she believed that it was all their fault. Tess interrupted her grandmother's rant by running up to her and telling her how glad she was to see her. The woman immediately calmed down and noted that she was also very happy to see her dear granddaughter. After which they began to walk towards her house, talking along the way. The old man even decided to say that it seemed to him that they should have already met her at the entrance, to which Raya answered him, saying that they were a little late, so she decided to make sure that they did not get lost along the way and therefore went to meet them. She also said that she was very glad to see Arthur, whom they had not seen for so many years. She believed that he had grown up quite a lot and had become quite a handsome guy, and if she were 100 years younger, she would definitely have hit on him. In response to these words, Arthur immediately told her that after she jumped out so unexpectedly, like a ghost, he almost wet his pants and no longer knew how to react to this statement. She wasn't exactly thrilled to hear those words, so she told the guy that in that case, he could ask Virian how dazzling her beauty was. So much so that at one point, men fell in piles as soon as she entered the room. Tess's mother confirmed this information, saying that it was in fact the pure truth, because her mother told her that all the young girls envied Aunt Rinia, although according to Winson, she was a strong average student and certainly not superior. But Rini had no doubt that the man would say so, because she still hadn't forgotten that Virian was only interested in one girl at that moment. Suddenly she realized that she had said too much and immediately turned to him to ask for forgiveness and say that she had behaved unreasonably when she said something like that. Arthur immediately noticed how the mood of everyone else dropped significantly. He immediately realized that these words were really unnecessary, and apparently the woman herself did not think about what she said. But suddenly this awkward silence was broken by the old man, who noted that in fact, it was he who should be asking for forgiveness. Moreover, he knows very well the fact that for the woman, it was also incredibly difficult. She decided to interrupt this dialogue and focus on what they had agreed on, and to do this, she had to point out that they would soon be there, so she suggested that they speed up and stop talking. A few minutes later, they actually came to the very place where the woman lived, and she was happy to invite them inside. They slowly walked through the passage, behind which they thought there should be a cozy hut, but it turned out to be a passage to a huge waterfall. And then the woman used a little magic and opened the passage further, but before they entered, she asked them to do everything possible not to create sources of light, and the entire way to her new home, they should go in the dark. They listened to her request, and all went deep enough into the darkness, thereby arriving at her new home, which was located deep in the cave. But when they were already inside, everything did not look as bad as it might seem from the outside, and while they were looking around, the woman decided to invite them to sit down, because they had a lot to discuss. At first, Arthur was silent and thought only about what kind of deviant magic allows one to create rooms that are many times wider on the inside than they look on the outside. This question worried him quite a lot. After a few hours, everyone was very tired and decided to go to bed, after which the woman smiled and again turned to the guy to tell him that she thought the fact that they all fell asleep should have alarmed him at least a little. Arthur thought for a bit and then told the woman that he had been through too much lately, and that it was becoming more and more difficult for him to be surprised by anything. But given the woman's words, he could assume that she most likely already knew everything, since she started this conversation. This brought a smile to the woman's face, to which she happily agreed and told Arthur that he was right. After which the guy decided to ask the woman if this meant that this conversation was intended only for his ears. Raya completely agreed with him here too, because, according to her, She wanted to talk to him when none of the other guests would hear it. And when she was finally ready, she told the guy that she felt that she should tell him about her powers as a soothsayer, which could not help but surprise Arthur. After all, he knew very well that this type of deviant magic is so rare that there is almost no information in Xyrus's books, and learning about the magic of divination from the soothsayer himself is a very great experience that the guy is unlikely to be able to get anywhere else. Moreover, the woman herself immediately saw that the guy was quite interested in learning about this, so she quickly began her story about what Arthur might have known, but she still considered it important information. According to her, all deviants, except elementals, need to find their own source of power with which they can use their magic. And as strange as it may sound, it's not at all like how ordinary mages use mana particles that are in the environment. For example, his mother is an emitter, and although mages can recover with mana, their recovery speed is no match for her spells. Therefore, throughout her life, she met many deviants, and the magic of each of them had its own unique properties, but they still had something in common, and this thing was their own supply of mana. According to the old woman, they used it to fuel their magic, which is what distinguished them from elemental deviants like Arthur. But returning to the conversation about soothsayers, their powers also developed differently. They could appear at any moment in life, and in most cases they were unpredictable flashes. Vague images of the future appeared in their minds quite often. But most of the time, they were too vague and fleeting to make out anything. In fact, the flashes didn't use up their mana at all, and it didn't seem like much of a useful power now that she couldn't control it. Then Arthur had to think about that spell she used when he was little, the one that allowed him to see his parents and talk to them. According to the woman, it was a spell she created that used her powers as a prophet to project images and nothing more. She also added that true divination is not reading the future, but knowing when and what will happen. Arthur interrupted her at one point to say that he didn't quite understand. If this was her true power as a soothsayer, and besides, her mana core didn't fuel this magic, then how did she do it at all? She thought about this question for a bit, and then finally gave the guy a clear answer when she said that she does it quite simply. She just uses her life energy, which helps her do it. She also said that every time the fortune tellers, want to look into the future, they shorten their own lives, and this is the true power of the fortune tellers. All other spells are nothing more than ordinary and at the same time useful tricks. After these words, she decided to remind the guy of the moment when she reminded him of Virian's girlfriend, and Arthur remembered this moment for a long time, because the reaction was rather strange. According to the old woman, her name was Lania, and she was also a prophetess and was much more powerful than all her friends and colleagues. After all, her flashes were much longer and clearer than hers, and moreover, they appeared much more frequently. Moreover, with her attractiveness and grace, she aroused the envy and admiration of every elf of their generation. Lani was the pride of their kingdom, and the townspeople extolled her as if she were an idol who was bound to save them. When she and Virian fell in love, they had a wonderful wedding ceremony, and at that time it seemed that fate itself was smiling on them. However, to her great regret, fate turned out to be cruel to her. The war between humans and elves was drawing to an end. Talk of a pact was in the air, but the tension was still very strong. Therefore, suspicions began to arise that people were still trying to show off their strength. And in the end, they turned out to be completely right, because the previous king of Sapin had hatched a final plan that was aimed at the heir to the throne, Eleanor. In other words, the woman wanted to tell Arthur that Virian was essentially the target of assassination attempts, which could not help but upset him. Lanaya was tormented by visions of his death, but little could be understood from them about how Virian would be overtaken by death, for each of her visions was in a fog. Arthur didn't quite understand how this was possible, because he was more than sure that she was a fortune teller and could change the entire future. Raya agreed with this, so she told the guy that when Lania tried to change something, her visions still repeated themselves, and in the end, only the reason for Virian's death changed. Virian was the only one who knew how it was affecting her, and so he begged her to stop, but out of desperation, she continued to do it behind his back. When Raya just looked into the future, she felt how days, weeks, maybe even months began to flow out of her body, and Lania did this almost every day in the name of the only one she loved so much. She basically put up with it all just for him, and in the end, she was able to buy Virion enough time before the current Glader King staged a revolution. After which, they were able to successfully overthrow him to end the war, and Lania achieved what she wanted so much, but in any case, she had to burn almost all of her life force. And as a result, a few weeks later, she died right in Virion's arms, which he experienced quite hard, and to this day, it is difficult for him to talk about it. After this, Raya hated him for a long time for this, and also her sister for leaving her alone in this huge world. Arthur was very surprised when he heard these words, because he did not think that Lania was Raya's sister. Now everything falls into place in his head. He immediately looked at Virion and thought about how he was always so cheerful and joked about everything. So for a long time, he could not believe that he had such a tragic past. Then she suddenly interrupted his thoughts to tell the boy that she had told him this, not out of sympathy, but because she had used the same powers that had ultimately destroyed her sister to look into his future. Moreover, she believed that all of this happened because she used the same powers that ultimately destroyed her sister to look into the future of Arthur, who was now sitting right in front of her. This caused a significant misunderstanding on the guy's part, because he couldn't find a single reason why this had to be done at all. As a friend, the conversation was interrupted by Sylvie, who jumped right onto Arthur's feet and began hissing at the woman, thereby showing that she did not exactly have good intentions towards him. The woman didn't get nervous and said quite calmly that it seemed like Arthur's beast Mana sensed that he was a little restless, which the guy himself confirmed, and also added that in general, his emotions with Sylvie were quite connected, and that's why she felt such things. After which, the guy quickly calmed his beast with the words that he was actually fine, and she was worrying about him for nothing, but he was still pleased that she treated him that way. After which, the woman decided to continue their dialogue and honestly tell the guy that even during their first meeting with him and his beast, she had flashes of his future. Arthur had already realized that the woman had apparently been interested in his personality long before their first meeting, and he wanted to find out as soon as possible why she was doing this at all and how widespread this phenomenon was. To which she confidently said that the appearance of so many visions about one specific person, and even naturally, simply could not happen. In other words, she wanted to tell Arthur that Dickathan was rapidly changing and entering a new era, so she wanted the guy to understand that he was always at the epicenter of these changes, and no matter what happened, he would be the one to whom they would come. This further burdened the guy and led him into a misunderstanding, so he decided to ask the woman a question in which he wanted to find out why he had to be at the center of these events. According to her, answering this question is not as simple as it might seem at first glance, after which she noted that if she tells him more than necessary now, then the results he wants to achieve will change, and then the world will be in danger. But on the other hand, she understood perfectly well the fact that if she gave him too little information and did not teach him what he needed to know, then his search for God would face significant problems that would lead to the destruction of the entire world. Arthur had already begun to get quite nervous about this and was citing arguments that Elder Rhine had sacrificed her life energy for this, and now he was more than sure that she was obliged to tell him what he should do and how to do it correctly. But suddenly he fell silent when he realized that apparently no one except him had ever known about this. Even Virion would probably have heard it for the first time. As soon as Arthur said this thought out loud, the woman asked him to be quieter and not talk about it so loudly. And right after these words, she laughed a little, and with a smile noted to the guy that she had lived quite a long life, and besides, she would hardly be able to use the information she had received in the future. But she still finds that when she looked into the guy's future, she made several problematic enemies and, as a result, moved to this isolated shelter where she doesn't really like living, but, unfortunately, she simply has no other choice. She understood what Arthur might tell her and therefore got ahead of him, told him that she herself had decided to do so, and that the extra effort was being made so that she could bring good news. And finally, it's time to see Arthur about what the woman has kept inside for so long, According to her, he will face many difficulties, and no matter what he chooses in the future, this fact will remain unchanged. If you believe the woman's words and her predictions, then on his way, Arthur will encounter horns and various obstacles. But even so, all she can tell the guy is that he needs an anchor, or to be more precise, someone with whom he has a strong connection or to whom he can return at any time, so that he will have an ultimate goal in life that will constantly flicker in his life and not allow him to simply give up. Arthur didn't quite understand what they were talking about and what exactly he needed to do, but he was in no hurry to ask about it and just wanted to listen to the woman until the end. Apparently, it turned out that she definitely didn't say everything she wanted to. And it happened that after her story, the woman asked a couple of leading questions which, in her opinion, should help him decide what he should achieve in his life. And in her opinion, this would determine his future path in this life. And before the guy answered this question for himself, the woman decided to give him two pieces of advice that she thought would help him. The first was that she believed people did terrible things for good reasons, so she asked him not to judge them superficially. The second was that most often the dangerous enemy is not the one who sits on the throne and controls the army, but rather the abandoned soldier to whom we have nothing to lose. She was very sorry, but that was all she could tell him and share with him. She would have been happy to give him much more, but it seemed to her that this should be enough. Arthur thought about her words for a bit, and at some point, in a quiet voice, asked the woman a question, which was that he would like to know what would happen if he made the wrong choices. She pestered him, came closer to him, and confidently said that the right choice is not always the best choice, and sometimes doing the wrong thing is the best they can do. After which she noted the fact that she and the guy had talked all night, and now she thought he should rest before he and Tess returned back. Meanwhile, the squad went out into the forest, and one of them noticed that this was the little thing that their leader gave that pig to Marcus. They immediately noted with anger that Marcus accepted it quite quickly and without difficulty, and also, according to them, his body simply could not withstand it. This made him smile even more, so he decided to ask them about it, or were they hesitant to try it? They didn't answer his provocative questions, so he continued to laugh and talk about how they weren't even allowed to do it because they were too weak. In other words, he quickly realized that there were simply no worthy people among them because they were all a disgrace and those who were simply not worthy. Viva's head was filled with thoughts that their poison was weaker than its core, and most likely, as soon as the drug entered their bodies, they would die immediately. At one point, his interlocutor couldn't stand all these words and literally started shouting that they didn't want to sit here with him and coddle him, because they still had at least a lot to do before tomorrow, especially after their informant warned them that the members of the disciplined committee had become more active, so they needed to start acting right now. In response to these screams, the guy with white hair decided to punish them and show who was really strong here. For this, he used his fire magic and literally put this guy on the ground. And then, with terrible eyes in which one could only see what was going on, he said that they would not be able to continue to pretend to be big shots for long, because they were just errand boys. He also held the flask of drugs in his hands and told them that their leader was still moving the pieces while they were here coddling him, which couldn't help but anger his interlocutor even more. After which, without any doubt, he opened the flask and drank everything that was inside, without even thinking about the consequences that might await him after that. The consequences of the debt were not long in coming, because as soon as the substance entered his body, it immediately began to act, and the guy felt it on himself. He fell to the ground and began to punch everything he saw. Apparently, the pain that pierced his body was unimaginably strong, and it was really hard for him to endure all of this. This made the guys start laughing at him and saying that apparently he, like them, couldn't cope with the drug, and for the sake of such a spectacle, they didn't even feel sorry for the time they wasted here. The guy who spoke the most immediately decided to say that now the gray-haired guy can continue to talk about how strong he is, hiding behind the backs of his family. But now they all know that a mutt will always remain a mutt. After which he came even closer to him and stepped on his head with his foot and said that since he was already about to die, it seemed to them that he needed to do it as quickly as possible, because they were losing more and more time while they remained here with him. Well, suddenly his words were interrupted when he felt an incredibly strong pain from the fact that his leg began to burn very strongly, as if I had put a hot frying pan on it. And after that, he was thrown back with incredible force several meters, which made them all fall silent and stop laughing. They realized that they were very wrong about this guy, and now they need to change something in order not to die at his hands. At that moment, memories of talking to his father, who scolded him for starting fights, and at the same time believing that he had become strong enough to waste his time like this and fool around, came into Sadov Vlasov's head. The man was very angry that the boy was still going to rely only on his parents and was wasting 1,000 gold coins in an attempt to forcibly pump up his pathetic body with strength. He wanted the boy to finally try to achieve something on his own and not just use the strength of his parents. Now his laughter was so strong that one could say with certainty that he had finally proven not only to himself and everyone else that he had become incredibly strong thanks to his efforts and the fact that he did not give up. Looking at this madman, his opponents threw down their weapons and quickly began to run away because they understood that there was simply no chance of defeating this madman. But it wasn't as simple as they thought, and the guy who decided to throw his ball and start running was the first to be hit. He didn't try to catch up. He simply used fire magic to unleash one powerful blow that literally destroyed Jun in a few seconds. Vodi tried to run up to him, but the second one stopped him and ordered him not to move anywhere because he had to help him first. In any case, he ran to this place and saw a terrible picture. There was simply nothing left of Jun, and apparently he arrived too late. This made the student even more angry, and so he began to release too much energy into his body, but he didn't care at all because he wanted to avenge his friend. Nosy, even to the point of madness, was completely indifferent to these blows, because the power inside him was so great that he did not even feel these attempts to inflict any kind of delirium on him. A few seconds later, he came closer to his new opponent and grabbed him by the neck to show him who was boss. As his opponent's life force began to rapidly drain, he added with a smile that he simply wanted them to see for themselves that the drug had worked better on him than on the pig. He destroyed absolutely everyone, and then returned to the same guy who laughed the most and put his foot on his head. Now he wanted to know what he was thinking now. The next morning, when everyone finally woke up, Raya realized that the calming herbs in the tea she had brewed the night before were stronger than she had expected, because she hadn't even thought that they would make everyone fall asleep. At least that's what she told everyone. Tess's father immediately said, with a smile, that there was really nothing wrong with it, and besides, each of them definitely needed to get some sleep, which they did successfully, so it even played into their hands. Although not everyone thought so, for example, Arian was not entirely happy about this, because he had urgent matters that he was going to take care of in the morning, but since these herbs were too strong, he was never able to wake up. Raya immediately began to say that apparently these things have something in common with the fact that his MI test turned a fairly large part of the palace into dust, which is why the old man had to immediately shut her mouth with the product that he came across first, and say that the vegetables were simply magnificent and she should try it too. In any case, she didn't want to tell the woman that the test was somehow scary or had destructive power. In fact, she wanted the girl to understand that her grandfather wanted to find something that would help suppress her beastly will, and then placed a small box right in front of her, inside of which, according to her, was an object that was supposed to help her. Upon opening the box, Tess immediately saw a small bracelet made of pure gold that had extraordinary powers, for which Tess was very grateful. Arthur, in turn, did not quite understand this act, because they had only talked about it yesterday, and the next day, the woman did something similar. When he said these words, most of those present did not understand at all what he was talking about, because they certainly did not talk about this. Arthur realized that he said too much, and went on to note that apparently he was the only one here who was strange, since they were still surprised by such things. The girl's father thanked Raya for always looking out for Tess. She smiled back and said that she was actually only happy about it, and now she suggested that they enjoy this evening, before the children set off on their journey. A few hours later, when everyone was ready to return, the woman led them to a special portal, where she informed them that with the help of these rocks, they would be able to return back to Cyrus. Arthur immediately approached Cana and spoke there, that it seemed to him that the teleportation gates had existed since ancient times, and the Royal Seven strictly monitored them, so it was quite strange for him that she was simply invited to have her own personal gate. In response, she simply continued to smile and pretend that everything was as it should be, which caused Arthur even more surprise. Meanwhile, the parents hugged their daughter and said that they would soon come to visit her, so she should not be upset about this. Vi also noted that before classes began, she shouldn't forget to stop by Good Sky's office, since he hadn't heard from her for a long time, so he wanted to make sure that the old woman was even alive. Tess told him that she would definitely fulfill his request, after which she ran up to her grandmother and thanked her for the warm welcome, and also said that she was very sorry that they could not stay longer. At that moment, Sylvie noticed that Arthur was a bit upset, so she decided to ask her father if everything was okay with him, to which he confidently replied that everything was fine, and he just felt a little happy. After which they, together with Tess, went into this portal, saying goodbye to their dear people along the way. A few seconds later, they were already on the other side of the world, where it was absolutely empty, and this caused a little doubt and alertness in Arthur, as it seemed to him that there should be a guard near every enemy. Tess couldn't help but agree with this, although the guy then added that he had heard that many people take days off because of the aurora's glow, since at that time trading is suspended and perhaps they simply don't have enough people, so they were removed from certain areas. In any case, they continued on their way and decided not to dwell on it, at least until they came to a city where it was incredibly beautiful, which made them stop and just admire the beautiful views for a while. The girl immediately noticed that no matter how often she saw the aurora's glow, it always looked better and better, which was simply impossible to get used to. After looking around for a bit, they went further into the house where they were met by Jasmine, who was very happy to see the boys, as they hadn't seen each other for a long time. And after her came the other boys, who were even more delighted to see the boy as a child prodigy, whom they could now hardly recognize. After which they all turned to Dan, who was told to immediately stop trying to look cool, because he was doing it very badly, which made him look even worse. Arthur, looking at his friends, was a little shocked, because so many years had passed, and he immediately noticed changes in each of them. And what surprised him most was that Dearden grew his hair out, and at first it turned out that he copied it from someone else, but then it turned out that he was inspired by Arthur. And after some time, a girl attacked Arthur, who began hugging him and shouting that he had become even sweeter and better, which definitely upset Tess. But she didn't remain in this state for long, because it was the girl who immediately pounced on her after Arthur, and simultaneously said that she, too, was very glad to see this charming little elf, who hadn't seen Vanya here for a long time. Arthur's parents suggested that he not stand in the aisle, but go inside so that they could talk and share news with each other. Tess felt a little awkward, and so she decided to say that she only planned to stop by to say hello and then head straight to the academy, because she had a lot of things to do at the academy and also needed to meet with Principal Goodsky, but she still thanked them for the invitation. Arthur felt like something was wrong with her, and so he came up to her to find out about it, to which she said that she just wanted to ask for her help in getting used to this bracelet, since apparently it was with her for a long time. She also wanted to tell him that as the student council president, she shouldn't be having fun here, since even Lilia was still at the academy. Arthur heard these words and immediately thought about the fact that he had promised his grandfather to be near her because most of her magic was suppressed now, and at any moment it could be extracted from her body and then they would start having serious problems. And suddenly she interrupted his thoughts when she told him that it was only for one night and everything would be fine, so he didn't have to worry about it. In the end, Arthur agreed, but still asked her not to overwork herself and not to forget about rest, because he, like no one else, remembered that her drones were still a little unstable. After their conversation, Tess was approached by Arthur's mother, who told her what she had done, that the girl would stay, and since she already had to go, she would like the girl to at least dress warmly. They all spent it together and wished her luck, and also did not forget to add that she could return to them forever. But still, they were a little sorry that the princess had to leave, but on the other hand, they did not deny the fact that the night had just begun and today they should rest as well as possible. Meanwhile, Arthur and her sister were talking about how his sister was very worried about him while he was traveling. At this point, she kept repeating this over and over again, so the other guys decided to take her away from Arthur so that she wouldn't bother him. After a while, the fun ended and some of the guys went to bed, but Arthur and his close friend went to talk a little, and she told the guy that he took over his father's baton and now topped the list of those his mother worries about, which Arthur himself could not help but agree with, because it turned out to him that this skill improves on its own, even without his efforts. She also said he was made for great things, so she wanted us to just remember our desires and hold on to what made him rise after he fell, and also not forget that he has been fighting all this time. At that moment, Arthur noticed for himself the thought that the elder had told him something similar, so he had already figured out these things perfectly. As for his interlocutor, he decided to clarify why she suddenly decided to start such conversations. Without thinking twice, she told him that she was actually just a little nervous about the discovery of a new continent and everything else, so she decided to tell Arthur about it so that he would be on his guard too. After which, in any case, she decided that it would be better for her to return to the house in order to prevent his comrades from accidentally burning it down, with which Arthur himself agreed, after which he noted that he would come a little later, and also thanked her for getting him out of there. She immediately told him that it was not really a problem for her. She just wanted to ask him to slip into his room and get some rest. As soon as the girl left, Arthur was already thinking about the fact that he did not know the reason why he ended up in this world, but he refused to believe that he had ended up here to become a simple pawn. He was sure that protecting the smiles and laughter of everyone he loved in this new world was his reason to continue living and staying alive. He cursed everyone who could interfere with this, and this is exactly the kind of fate he would like to create for himself or his family. Meanwhile, the crazy gray-haired guy turned into a huge owner of an army and was ready to attack everyone who had ever offended him, to show that he was actually something they should fear. By this time, the guys were more or less ready, and as soon as Dora Drea came to them, they would activate this magic stone. They decided to check with Kaya again before they started, whether he was sure that he didn't want to join them. They thought that these crazy cultists were planning to launch a full-scale attack in the near future, so they needed to keep themselves in shape, otherwise they wouldn't be ready for an attack at any moment. But he assured them that he had been patrolling all day today, and therefore he believed that extra training would only harm him, when suddenly their conversation was interrupted by a girl who burst into their room with the words that she had brought several overwhelming bracelets for their new training. She was in too much of a hurry, so she tripped over the rope that was in front of the entrance and fell down, along with the bracelets. They approached her and started talking about how if she wanted them to steal all their mana right before a possible attack, then that was a good idea. But in general, they thought that it wouldn't help me at all. But still, they didn't understand perfectly that Dora Drea didn't want anything bad. She just wanted things to be as good as possible, and after everything was over, they would really be useful to them. In any case, everyone was there, and so they asked Kay to activate the barrier, which he did successfully. The barrier was activated, and immediately after that, a huge circle was created around them, in which they were all together, and this is how their training would begin. But one thing really worried them, and that was that the courier was red. And so they started telling Kai that they thought there was something wrong with the barrier and it needed to be removed. They even told him that perhaps this was a wonderful barrier and a great thing that he had created, but they still wanted him to let them out of there as soon as possible, because they felt that something was wrong here. But no matter how loudly they spoke, no one heard them, and no one removed the barrier, so they came to do about the fact that no one could hear them inside the barrier. Therefore, they decided to start hitting the barrier in order to try to break it down and get out of it as quickly as possible, but no matter how hard they tried, they didn't succeed. Over time, they realized that this would not achieve anything, and that they were simply wasting mana, until one of them realized that somewhere around here there must be an emergency switch, which is intended for just such cases. But when they opened a special niche for this switch, they discovered that, unfortunately, this switch was not in working order, and apparently someone had destroyed it before. Each of the guys had it all figured out in their heads. They understood what had happened. Apparently, they had simply been set up, and they didn't even suspect it. Apparently, this was only the beginning, because a few seconds after they understood everything, some kind of projectile began to fly towards them, which someone was firing from the outside. It wasn't a big problem for them to break all these shells, since they were made of stone, and it was clear that they had enough strength. But in any case, the question of what was happening and who was to blame for all of this was still relevant for them. At least that's what it looked like at first glance, but a few seconds later, some warriors ran into the circle, each of whom wielded different elements, and apparently they definitely didn't want to make friends with them. They realized that this was a trap, so they decided that they simply had to take their positions and come to the conclusion that this was no longer a training session, but a real battle. None of them ran away or surrendered. Each of them was ready to go into this battle and fight to the last, as long as they had the strength to do so. At some point in the battle, they managed to move forward a little, and this gave them a chance to get out of this circle, and it seemed like this was their only chance. The gray-haired madman interrupted them and remarked that apparently they still had not realized that they had absolutely no chance against him and his army. Turning to face him, the guys couldn't believe their eyes that they were seeing the same Lucas, who was incredibly weak, and now behind him was an incredibly strong energy that literally told them that they had no chance. In addition, the guy told them that Kai was the one who locked them in this trap. The guys couldn't believe it, and so they shouted back at him that it was all a lie and he had made it all up. In response to these screams, Lucas ran and went on the attack, shouting at the madam that he had no reason to lie, because he was capable of destroying them without it. The guys didn't expect him to be so powerful and strong, so they didn't even have time to block his incredibly strong blow, which threw them back several meters. They didn't try to attack him, and at least slightly slow down this attack, but his fiery spirit, which had recently become even stronger, literally did not allow them to do this. In the periods between blows and cancers, the guys thought about the fact that the barrier must have been fully formed, and the mana-suppressing bracelets that Dora brought. And so they had an idea of how they could create energy large enough to get out of this barrier, but to do this, they needed to all gather together in one place. She figured that doing this would be much more difficult than just saying it, because she had no idea what this guy had taken. But now he was stronger than any professor, and all of them combined. They tried to attack him and the others, but so far they were unsuccessful, and all their attempts ended in failure, because Lucas was truly a head taller than any of them. But in reality, his main target was not these guys, but who would soon get as close to him as possible, and this could not help but please Lucas. So he sent his guys back, which made OK start to worry because he thought that Lucas would help capture these guys in the winter, but apparently his plans changed, so he wanted to know what happened. These are the words Lucas said to the guy with a smile, saying that he had helped him, but now he had a more important mission that had to be completed immediately. The boys were left alone against Lucas's friends. This was bad news for them, because even though Lucas was gone, his warriors were growing in numbers, and so they began to think that they might lose this battle. Suddenly, one of them had a great idea, which was that she shouted for Faye and Kay to use protective spells, thanks to which they could get out of here. Immediately after her words, they instantly fulfilled her entire request and used the very spells with which they could subsequently get out. This spell at least gave them time to come up with a plan to get their thoughts out, although the opponents weren't going to just leave the guys alone. They quickly broke down the protective barrier that was holding back their attack, and now they had everything they needed to attack the guys and finally destroy them. Meanwhile, the boys were actively destroying the barrier that was preventing them from getting out, when suddenly Dora shouted that she would buy them as much time as possible so that they could escape, and before the boys could say these words, she turned into a stone man and ran to attack. How he tried to stop her and not let her make such a crazy decision, but in response, she simply kicked him and called him an idiot, since he decided to follow her and not save himself. After which she began to actively fight her opponents, and at first she did very well. She delivered several accurate blows to each of them, which ultimately led to a good counterattack. Meanwhile, the rest of the guys got out of this crazy barrier and ran through the academy to split up and look for the professors who were supposed to help them as quickly as possible. But suddenly they stopped and interrupted their search because they heard an incredibly loud noise that made them stop moving. And what we won't see was, in fact, an incredibly terrifying sight that could make them stand in a stupor, because outside the window they saw a huge number of monsters that destroyed everyone in their path, and whoever it was, a student or a professor, could not cope with these monsters. At that moment, she was going about her business in a carriage and thinking that the last thing she wanted to do was worry Arthur. But still, thoughts often flashed through her head that she had this feeling that she could not control her body normally, because her novels were completely exhausted. So I could only hope that Director Good Sky would help me sort this out, otherwise things would be very, very bad. Suddenly, her thoughts were interrupted by some strange earthquake, which forced the girl to immediately come to her senses and concentrate. The carriage immediately stopped, and the girl went out into the street to ask what had happened, and her driver asked her to look ahead, and then she would understand everything herself. And so it happened. The girl looked ahead and saw a huge barrier, which without further explanation was clear why it was created. The carrier immediately turned to the princess and said that he did not know what to do next, to which the girl faithfully and quickly replied that they urgently needed to return back. But before she could finish speaking, a powerful explosion thundered from her friend, which threw the girl back several meters and silenced her. When she came to, she saw how her cart was literally smashed into small pieces, and she herself could not believe what had happened. As a friend, she heard a familiar voice that told her that he had been waiting for her for a very long time, and that she had finally come here, and she was also completely alone. So she believed that the mission was going much easier than he could have imagined. Then the girls saw the new Lucas for the first time, who was no longer the weakling she knew. Now there was only the most powerful energy around him, and defeating such an opponent would be incredibly difficult even with her core. In any case, Tess decided that she needed to put out the fire as quickly as possible so that the carrier could get out. Well, no matter how hard she tried and whatever she did, apparently Lucas was not going to leave all this just like that. As soon as the girl tried to use her power, he dealt another crushing blow to the same place and completely destroyed everyone who was with her. And after that, he began to approach her closer and closer and said along the way that it was a little rude of her to ignore the person who was talking to her. He also believed that it was worth worrying about himself and not about some pathetic carrier. But before he could finish these pathetic words, she responded with a blow that forced the guy to close his mouth and listen only to her. She was not a little like that with him. She just wanted to make him shut his mouth and not say anything like that anymore. When they got drunk, she still added a few more words and told the guy that she didn't know what the fuck he was going to do, but she assured him that everything would end right there. These words made Ulukesa laugh quite loudly. HIV, he would never have believed that she would be the one who would stop him, and in general, he does not think that anyone can stop him in such a state. Because of this, he explained his confidence by saying that the girl had no chance, if only because she could barely maintain any concentration of her strength, which in his case was too weak an opponent. Tess immediately understood what was going on, because looking at her grandmother's bracelet, she realized that it not only suppressed her will of the beast, but also most of her magic. As a friend, my thoughts were interrupted when Lucas came too close to her and grabbed her by the clothes, and then added that it would be right for her to be a good girl and not talk to him at all, because who knows, maybe in the end she will like him even more than her pathetic boyfriend. Hearing this, the test began to tell him that if this was all that mattered, then the fact that he had not destroyed her here and now meant that she was not his target. And after these words, I also said with a smile that he used a drug that destroyed Marcus and tracked her movements. And all this only means that all this is apparently because of Arthur. This made Lucas even more angry, so he threw the girl to the ground without any hesitation and shouted that she should immediately shut her mouth because in fact she does not know the truth and will never know it. But in response, the girl began to tell him that she knew for sure that his inferiority complex had moved to a new level, and she told him all this taking into account her fear. For these words, he continued to beat her and did it without any problems. He believed that this is how it should be. At some point, he even told her that he had not destroyed her, and that this did not mean at all that he needed her whole, and that he would not do this in the future. But suddenly she interrupted his speech when she took his hands and said that she also did not expect to remain unharmed. Lucas immediately understood what had happened, and immediately began to scream, and that she should immediately let go of his hand, and began not to vouch for herself, although the girl certainly did not intend to do this. But she still let them go to you, and it seemed that Lucas would destroy her now. But everything was not so simple, because she managed to cast a spell on him that literally immobilized his movement, and he could not use his power, which is why Lucas was perplexed. And while he was trying to understand what had happened to him, she gathered all the strength in her fists and delivered a fairly strong blow to him, which threw the guy back several meters, thereby bringing him to his senses and making him understand that he was actually not as strong as he thought. Tess was on edge at that moment. Her strength was mentally evaporating, but she still continued to think that she, as Arthur's only person, must, no matter what, hold out until the very end and give time to her friends. Well, suddenly my thoughts were interrupted when Luca shouted that he was tired of all this and he wanted to end it all, and the princess in this ment modem only said that she cannot be allowed to use her as bait to catch Arthur. These were the girl's last thoughts before she passed out and lost consciousness, after which Lucas came closer to her and put her bracelet on her hand, still scattered, and said that she did not use club magic, he would still be able to afford to destroy her. So he believed that she should not take off this bracelet anymore, otherwise he would insert it into her body, after which he grabbed her by the hair and simply dragged her along with him to where he wanted to go. He slowly opened the barrier that his man had created and walked into it with the Tess. The girl tried to do at least something at that moment, but the big problem was that she simply could not move. Her body did not obey her, no matter how hard she tried. That was all she could do at that moment. Meanwhile, all the students and professors of the academy tried to fight the monsters, and did it as fictitiously as they could. But in any case, their strength was not enough, and the monsters gradually defeated them. Only through teamwork and diligence did they manage to destroy at least a few monsters and try to get out of this situation. But in any case, it was all too bad for them. Not only were they attacked by monsters, but after some time, some people in robes came to them and began to tell him that the students must raise both hands and swear allegiance to their deeds, and only then will they stop attacking them and give them the opportunity to live on. Everyone who does not do this will be left without their precious life, and they will simply destroy them. According to them, the elves and dwarves should not resist, and as soon as they destroy their core novels, they will be able to leave peacefully. Most of the guys simply didn't understand how the staff, especially the director, could have allowed the situation to get so bad and so many students to die at the academy. But after some time, the answer to this question presented itself. These students noticed that among these rebels, there were quite a lot of professors. They tried to resist and do something to free themselves, but it was all in vain. No matter how they attacked these people, they were in any case much stronger than them. One of them kept shouting at all the guys to stay as far away from him as possible. Otherwise, they would decide for themselves if they came closer and ruined his plans, then he would destroy them with just one spell. But his words were cut off immediately after some unknown force threw him back several meters and literally destroyed all of his magical power in a matter of seconds. It was Curtis who showed up incredibly on time and helped his guys who were almost destroyed. Immediately after that, he ordered them to run to the training center, because there are several good professors there who protect all the guys who come to them. As for all of these guys, according to him, most of them are fine. Only recently they split up to find those who can help, but unfortunately, Dora and the fairies most likely died. He also said that they had fallen into a trap set by these cultists. Adora and the fairies held them back while they were trying to get out of it, but they themselves were never able to get out of there. The guy Kirch was talking to suddenly started yelling at him and asking where Arthur was and what was going on here and why the director was allowing this to happen. Curtis said that, fortunately, Arthur and Tess did not have time to return to the academy. As for the student council, he is fine, and he only recently separated from Lily and Clive. He sighed with relief, because he realized that not everything was as bad as it might seem from the outside. In any case, in Curtis's opinion, at the moment he doesn't know what they can do, it seemed to him that they can try to stay alive to wait for the soldiers, or they have the option to continue the fight. But in this case, no one knows how fate will turn out. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by an incredibly loud sound that literally cut their ears, and because of which they could not even stand normally on their 2 feet. And a few seconds later, they heard a voice that sounded throughout the academy, which told the students and teachers of the academy that his pets would no longer bite, so he kindly invited them to follow him to the clock tower, because it was time to begin the final ceremony. After all, according to him, if they miss this ceremony, then they will regret it for the rest of their lives. After some time, a huge crowd of people gathered near the academy, among whom were many parents and students who simply wanted to see their son or daughter and hear the latest news. But they were not allowed inside, and they did not understand at all why they could not get inside, although they had every right to do so. All the guys near this barrier told them was to stay as far away from it as possible. After all, according to them, their magicians are now actively working to make it possible to get inside, so they asked them not to panic and just wait. According to some mages, guilds and artifact creators never forged this kind of barrier because its integrity structure is on a completely different level than barriers. This barrier is much stronger and more modern. But most of the men trying to get inside didn't care at all and weren't interested in what was different about it. All they were interested in was when they could break it. But according to the specialist, they don't have the appropriate artifacts to do this with. All they could do was contact the artifact creators guild branch in another city and request a more powerful beam drill from them. But it seems there were some problems with the delivery of this item as well. Therefore, one of the specialists suggested that they request help from the copies, since in his opinion they would definitely be able to break through this barrier. But as it turned out, they had already tried to do this, and the copies were dealing with the incident all over the continent, so they definitely would not come here. Then, one of the specialists literally started shouting that this was a carefully planned attack, which is why one of the commanders had to shut him up and tell him to speak more quietly about it. Because if he continued to speak so loudly, the panic would only increase and they would get into even more trouble. However, according to the guy, there were already people who had spread out along the base of the barrier in search of its weak spots, and according to him, it would take some time, but they were still rushing inside. All the commander told him was that they could only hope that they could get inside before it was too late. Curtis and his friend were at this point slowly moving forward and trying to recognize their guys amidst the compressed attack. At some point, Curtis mentioned that he was going to go look for the rest of the disciplinary committee members, and as for Elijah, he asked him to stay here and not make any moves. The revived document was not entirely happy to hear such words, because all around him he saw a rather sad picture that frightened him no less than the monsters that attacked them. He just looked at this whole picture and couldn't understand how this could have happened. The students who were unlucky enough to not get out in time simply stood near this barrier and asked to be saved. They wanted to live and asked to be let out. As a friend, their screams were interrupted by a very loud sound, which made them all have to cover their ears and close their mouths for a moment, because if they even tried to say anything, they would be instantly destroyed. Immediately after this sound, they saw a man in a mask who told them in a strange voice that he was very grateful to them for coming today at his invitation. Seeing this man, all the students started shouting at him that he had to let them out, because if he didn't do it, he definitely wouldn't be able to leave this place and would face a huge punishment. In response to these words and requests, he simply began to laugh as hard as he could, and later added that even despite how much death they had to witness today, they still allowed you to say such things. He also decided to say that they had some crazy tents that were not very far away and that they still had a problem with realizing the seriousness of the situation. Afterwards, he took out some object from his bag and threw it on the ground. Apparently, it turned out that maybe this way they would finally understand what was going on here. It was the head of some man who had been recently destroyed, and only one head was taken with him. Absolutely everyone in the video started running away from this terrible picture as quickly as possible, and as for Elijah, he fell to the ground from shock at what he saw. Until the very end, he could not measure it with his eyes and mentally resisted himself, saying that this could not be true, and this definitely could not be her. But apparently it was true, and they really saw the head of the Dora, who went to protect them. They tried to break the barrier with their fists in order to get inside and punish the bastard for what he did to her. But no matter how hard they tried, the barrier was so strong that they couldn't get inside. That's why he started screaming at the top of his lungs and telling them to get out of this barrier and fight with him, if he considers himself strong and a man at all. This made this madman laugh and smile even more, as he couldn't believe that the guys, even after he had demonstrated his strength, were saying such things and hoping that they could defeat him at all. The guy didn't care at all about what he was saying. He just kept hitting that barrier with his fists and shouting that this guy should immediately go beyond it and fight them. But suddenly his screams were interrupted when he felt some kind of force that literally pulled him inside this barrier. After a few seconds, he saw in front of him a man in a mask, without this mask. But he didn't care at all how it happened. He immediately used his power and ran to attack. He wanted to destroy this guy as quickly as possible and avenge his girlfriend. He accelerated so much that he could develop incredibly strong and lightning-fast speed, thanks to which he could deliver a very devastating blow, which is what he did. Most of the spectators of this fight were confident that the guy would be able to win thanks to this blow, because in their opinion, even the professor could not block such a blow. So watching how Theo fought, they were confident of his victory. But their thoughts were interrupted immediately after they saw Taolu a few seconds later on the ground, with a broken leg and incredibly loud screams about how much pain he was in. And a few seconds later, his enemy came even closer and told Theo with a smile that, if this is all he can do, then he has greatly disappointed him, even though this was a battle to show the guy who he is. And then, he said with a crazy smile, that there was a little blood left on his face, and therefore he wouldn't mind helping him clean it up. And immediately after these words, he used his fire magic, thereby burning Theo's body in just a few seconds, giving him no chance to survive. After this terrible act, he continued to laugh and say that now he looks much better, because now his face is clean and beautiful. And right after he dealt with Theo and burned his body to ashes, he turned to everyone else and shouted that he would now allow himself to begin their main event, for which they had gathered here. These were the last words before all the boys and professors who resisted were gathered into one pile and began to be led to the center of the barrier with the help of chains. Among them one could see the princess, who was unconscious and in a terrible state. Curtis and the others simply couldn't believe their eyes at what was happening, because their friends were destroyed before their eyes, and it was done in an incredibly cruel way, which is why they were eager to destroy each of them for this. They tried with all their might to stop him and not let him break into this barrier, because everyone around understood perfectly well that if he did this, he would die after these guys, because for now, they do not have enough power to deal with this cruel guy. The girl behind him held him as tightly as she could, telling him all the while that he should just wait and not rush headlong like Theo had, because they couldn't lose him too. But these words angered the guy even more, because as soon as he heard from them that he had to wait, it literally tore him apart from the inside, because he believed that they could not just wait and let this man destroy everyone else. And suddenly, his scream was interrupted by another girl who came closer to him and slapped him, thereby calming him down and bringing him to his senses. She told him with tears in her eyes and utter disappointment that they should think about how they could save them and stop this monster. In other words, she wanted to convey to them that they needed to find a way to protect everyone, and not just rush headlong and fight. She also asked him to understand that if he did not calm down and went to certain death, then they would definitely not be able to come up with anything and would most likely lose. These words made Curtis calm down, and he realized that his friends were actually right, and doing such things would be really stupid and unwise. So in the end, he calmed down and agreed with them, thereby promising them that he would not rush into battle headlong and only hope that he could defeat them all on his own. As a friend, their conversation was interrupted by the voices of other students who were shouting that something strange was happening there. The whole point was that Lucas's people had brought in another guy who would be incredibly difficult for them to lose. Elijah couldn't believe his eyes, because he was more than sure that she simply physically couldn't be at school, and therefore he wasn't worried about her safety. But now everything is completely different. As a friend, all their thoughts were interrupted by that same Luca, who, with a laugh on his face, began to say that he had finally managed to attract their attention to himself, so first he would like to introduce himself. After which he spoke about how he had mentioned before, his name was Draniv. If you believe his crazy words, then he came here not to destroy them all, but on the contrary, to save them and give them life. He told them that he came from distant lands, where the weak had to face all the cruelty of this world. And now, he is sitting here for a reason, because his main goal was to meet with the elite delicately, because where he came from, they are complete trash. Therefore, in his opinion, he will be happy to teach and demonstrate his skills to those who seem worthy to him and pass them on. In other words, he wanted to tell each of them that when his lord and master captured these new lands, they could find a place for themselves in this kingdom. So he asked them to take these words seriously, and finally rejoice in the fact that they had been given the opportunity to gain powers that they could never have imagined. Well, after this long but not entirely reasonable speech, he asked Luca to come forward and show himself in front of everyone else. Lucas didn't wait long and went out to the center with his new victim to show off everything he had gained with this strange madman. Lucas began to slowly open his robe with a smile and spoke freely there that the powerful members of the disciplinary committee and even the genius elven princess were worth nothing against his strength. Elijah couldn't help but shout that Lucas was simply an unimaginable idiot who would soon suffer the fate he deserved. LG didn't understand at all how he could study at this academy and betray her so easily, so he went closer to the barrier and started knocking on it with all his might and shouting at him that the guy had betrayed them all. In response to these words, Lucas lifted the princess and moved closer to her neck to show everyone that his new power allowed him to do this without punishment, and no matter how hard they tried, he could do this to any of them. Each of his similar actions made Elijah even more innocent. It seemed that the boy was now capable of exploding from this anger, because he had never seen anything like this before and did not think how it could be survived. From this anger, the guy began to release serious energy, which threw all his allies in different directions, and the guy himself simply did not understand what was happening and how to control such a state. At some point, this energy stopped, and Elijah realized that this was something completely new, but in any case, he felt incredible pain inside his entire body. But this pain seemed to be something new for him. He was incredibly scared to feel such emotions and such pain, but in any case, he understood that this was not just like that, and it needed to be used, and it needed to be done right now. He was immediately attacked by the monsters that we controlled the Ragna, because he thought that the guy might bring some problems, so he needed to be eliminated as soon as possible. But instead of running away, La just continued to walk straight, as if he thought he could defeat them. And apparently this loyalty was not without reason, because as soon as the monsters flew close enough, the guy used his magic and destroyed them all together with literally one spell. His gaze was so insane that it seemed that this was not at all the Elijah that everyone knew. The guy himself also understood this perfectly well, because in his head the only thoughts were that he had changed, and now his body seemed to be under the control of another person. All the other guys rushed madly to stop him because they thought they were capable of doing so thanks to their element. But at some point, they were stopped by their leader, who ordered them to stop immediately and stop doing stupid things for no reason. Apparently, he gave this order for a reason, because a few seconds later he saw how the guy's energy weakened, and he literally began to fall to the ground. Elijah himself understood perfectly well that his body was not strong enough to withstand such energy, but on the other hand, it would have made absolutely no difference, because all he needed at that moment was to withstand enough to destroy Lucas. So he used all the power he could and aimed the blow at Lucas. Lucas, in turn, did not expect Elijah to be so strong, so he will not be able to fully recover from this crazy blow, but in any case, the arrow LGE did not cause enough damage to destroy the guy once and for all. And this was very bad news for Elijah, because he spent almost all his strength on this blow, but was still unable to achieve the desired result. Lucas, in turn, stopped smiling and looked at Ligas with a completely different look. Now he understood perfectly well that his power was not so great as to say such things. Dranju approached Elijah in the document and held the guy back so that he would not completely lose his vital energy. Elijah couldn't even move at that moment. All he could do was mentally think about where Arthur had disappeared to when they needed him so badly. Modesty, devotion, determination, and courage. These words were constantly repeated to the boy, even when he didn't yet know their meaning. These 4 qualities will enable the heart to become like a sharp blade. This was precisely the credo of the Blade Heart family, into which the girl was born, and therefore she sincerely believed that, despite any circumstances, she could follow this secret doctrine. A few years later, she realized that she had been incredibly naive, and now she simply did not understand with what magic Elijah was able to break through the barrier and then deliver a crushing blow to his opponent. But at that moment, her thoughts were different, and now it seemed that the most suitable cop was to finally fight back against this monster, who, without any doubt, was destroying her friends. But no matter how much she didn't want to do it, at some point she realized that her body was literally unable to move. She just stood there and couldn't move either her arm or her legs. As a friend, my thoughts were interrupted when one of the professors shouted that they should all move aside and make way for him. It was Professor Greener. And even though his wounds were incredibly huge and he definitely shouldn't have been the first to go into battle, he still believed that while the barrier was broken, they simply couldn't miss this chance, and they were obliged to go into battle first. The girl, looking at this, simply did not believe that in such a state they would be able to overcome the brawl, and in general, the question arose in her head about why the professors were simply going to meet their death. No matter how much Claire wanted it, no matter how much she believed in her, I understood perfectly well that they were just cabbage rolls, who in a few minutes would face the same fate as the previous guys, but in any case, she could not say a word to them. How come I was suddenly interrupted by a guy who asked Claire to come to her senses and finally tell them what they were even going to do next? They wanted to ask the girl whether they should now gather all their strength and provide support to the professor. Claire instantly became upset by this question. I couldn't even imagine why they were even asking her about this. But the answer to this question was quite simple, because she was the one who held the position of leader of the disciplinary committee, and therefore they were ready to follow any of her instructions. She didn't know what to say in response to these words. Her head was only thinking that they could just rely on the professors and wait for news from them. Besides, she was so scared that she didn't understand at all why they would waste their lives in vain. But suddenly those same words that had been repeated to her since childhood popped into her head again. Modesty, loyalty, determination, courage. All of this made her at some point start shouting that those who were frightened and wounded should stay behind, and those who were capable of fighting should go with her. After which, she set her sword on fire using the element of fire and said that now they would begin the fight for Cyrus. As a friend of the rag, he approached Lucas to tell the guy that their plans had changed a little and they would now act differently. He said he was going to be the first to return and hoped Lucas would join them soon, right after he takes care of the retreating TSO and gets rid of all this garbage. Lucas wasn't happy with this, so he immediately grabbed Early by the shoulder and yelled at him about why he was even taking this guy along with him. But as soon as he asked this question, the answer was a powerful surge of energy that literally made him weak on his knees, after which he heard from the dragon that he was a pathetic tool who dared to resist his master, and for this he would punish him. But his speech was interrupted by another man with a rag, who said that they had prepared everything, and they could proceed to the next plan. This news was good news for you, so he let Lucas go, and finally told him that he would hope that the guy would not disappoint him and would still show what he was capable of. All the academy professors and students who were ready to fight, meanwhile, ran actively after the dragon, because they most of all did not want to let him escape. They sincerely believed that they had enough strength not only to stop him, but also to destroy him and never remember him again. At that moment, Luca burst into the battle, using all his new strength to stop those annoying bugs that were bothering him. He was very angry because the dragon had treated him like that, so he decided that he would take it out on his new opponents, whom he was going to simply destroy once and for all. The academy professors weren't going to give in so easily, so they used some of their most powerful spells, with which they were confident they could stop the boy. Then they tried to shout at him to stop and end all this pain, because in that case, not only he, but also other students of the academy would suffer. But he didn't care at all about their words. He just continued to use all his skills and tried to destroy as many people as possible. Lucas's allies also did not stand still and decided to help him, using their elements as well as their monsters. The professor, looking at all this, understood perfectly well that she alone would definitely not be able to cope with them all, and she urgently needed to come up with something. But suddenly her thoughts were interrupted when she saw how all these monsters and madmen were covered by a hail of elements that literally swept them off the face of the earth. These were the students of the academy who immediately ran after the professors to help them, and they were more than ready to ensure the safety of the prisoners and help the professors in this difficult matter. Although she was happy for their help, she still believed that what they were doing was wrong, and therefore ordered them to leave there immediately, because it was incredibly dangerous there. But Claire believed that this was their battle too, so they were not going to retreat and were ready to help them in everything. Moreover, in the girl's opinion, it was precisely for this moment that they were trained so diligently, because they also wanted to avenge their friends and destroy everyone who was guilty of this. The woman realized that she would not be able to convince them otherwise, so she agreed to their conditions, but asked them to be extremely careful because she did not want any more casualties. But suddenly their conversation was interrupted when Claire was literally trapped and tied up on all sides, which made her unable to use her powers, especially fire. Through fire and fog, she will go to her friend, Kai, who put them in this barrier, and therefore the girl with tears in her eyes began to scream at him about how he could do this, especially she spoke about Tu and Dory. Instead of answering her questions, he simply turned around and slowly began to walk towards the portal through which his master had emerged. Well, suddenly her thoughts were interrupted when she felt an incredibly strong pain that pierced her body in 1 second. A few seconds later, she saw a huge blade in front of her that pierced her body. Her friends immediately ran to her to help the girl, shouting at the same time that she needed to be patient a little and help would definitely come. 2 sharp, polished ball-like horns adorned the dragon's head on each side. The crystal's prominent, bright black scales shone so brightly that shadows were almost invisible, and in its eyes was such a strong, wise force that even veterans would not have dared to move. But despite the awe the dragon inspired, his heart fluttered in fear for the boy who stood before that dragon. In every step he took, she felt a subtle, yet still unshakable confidence. Every cell of this guy's body exuded a raw rage, so unbearable and cruel that the only thing Klasa regretted at that moment was that she would not be able to see Lucas's face with her own eyes after his defeat. At that moment, although Luca himself was trembling with fear, he was mentally thinking that his mental abilities and reflexes had grown so much that he could use high-level spells. He also did not choose that the bait available to him for use is almost exhausted, and it is thanks to the elixir of Dran that he has gone beyond the limits of what is possible for mere mortals, and now the so-called elite are nothing more than some pathetic bugs for him. All these thoughts made you also think about how strong he was. He just didn't understand where he got this feeling from, as if he was feeling like an icy sweater and inside, and it was pressing more and more with every second. In any case, he decided to get out of this state and enter into a fight that could not be ignored, so to be sure, he called Arthur a pet who would obey only him today. He looked him straight in the face and said that if Arthur thought that the overgrown lizard could help him, then he was deeply mistaken, because even the highly respected professors of the academy could not lay a finger on him, which gave him even more confidence in this fight. But while Lucas was going on and on about this whole speech, Arthur and his pet simply walked past him for a month as if he didn't exist. Meanwhile, the rest of the guys who were on Lucas's side, seeing this dragon, couldn't believe their eyes, and so their movements were immediately frozen. They couldn't move and just waited until they were pardoned. Arthur at that moment approached the princess, who lay unconscious and in a terrible state. As for Lucas, he became even more angry, and all because Arthur simply ignored him, although he said the most offensive things that came to his mind. At that moment, Arthur was examining the princess, and in his head he was thinking that, apparently, she had been drugged so that she would not resist, but besides a couple of Sinkovich scratches, she had nothing serious. This calmed the guy down quite a bit and brought him to his senses, because he was most worried that something terrible would happen to the princess. Meanwhile, Lucas continued to laugh and tell Arthur that when he mocked the princess, she called Arthur, although he did not even come to her. And if he came with all the possible features and began to say that he is not entirely sure that Arthur will be able to maintain his sanity while he watches how he will play with the girl about whom he cares so much. These words angered not only Arthur but also Sylvie, who stood nearby the whole time, and every word Lucas said made her more and more try to control her emotions and not attack this tailor to destroy him forever. But even taking these words into account, Arthur still continued to ignore him and do what he came here for. This made Lucas even more angry, so his firepower was at its maximum level, so he began to shout at him that he was a redneck who did not dare to ignore him and stand with his back to him while he was talking to him, so he would break every bone in his body, so that he could only cry while watching him speed up the teas in front of him. But suddenly his words were interrupted when he felt an incredibly strange sensation, which he had once had. A feeling as if a mad demon was tearing apart his insides, which did not give him peace, because he did not understand why his body was reacting in this way. Lucas, they were going out of his head. Why is he, unlike the respected professors at the Cyrus Academy, terrifying him? Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted by Arthur, who rose to his feet and told him that Lucas seemed to him like a wasp, which he considered unnecessary to destroy. But now he realized that he had made a mistake, because he had completely forgotten that when Asok bites, it causes a lot of harm and simply needs to be destroyed. Fear immediately struck Lucas, and he immediately saw how some strange hands began to emerge from the ground, which literally embraced his body. The guy didn't understand what was happening at all and how it was possible, and his strength literally evaporated somewhere, and he couldn't even control his emotions. This made him start to get even more angry, because all he could think about was that everything shouldn't have been like this, because in his opinion, he should have been much stronger than Lucas. But now all he could think about was how he, such a pathetic little bug, could instill so much fear in him. He was torn apart, but his thoughts still continued to flow like a stream, and he only thought about Ali and how many people and animals this guy had destroyed in order to achieve such a suffocating and oppressive thirst for blood. Well, even in such a state, when fear almost consumed his entire body, the guy was able to find the strength in himself to break this trap into several parts and continue the fight again. At that moment, Arthur looked at this guy with such strange eyes, which were simultaneously calm and at the same time the strongest storm that was ready to sweep Lucas from this earth. But in any case, he remained calm, and all he said to Sirius was to ask her to protect Tessia. After which, Arthur revealed that he actually also possessed ice magic, which caused mixed emotions in Lucas, because he certainly did not expect that the guy was hiding not only fire magic, but ice magic. But for him, this was just another little thing, which he did not even intend to pay attention to. As soon as he had the opportunity, he immediately began to attack Arthur with the help of his new skills. Well, no matter how hard Lucas tried, his strength was still too little to cause any harm to Arthur, because with just one movement, he was able to return from this blow and, moreover, he also grabbed Lucas's weapon. And then he delivered a counterblow that struck Lucas right in the heart, from which it was impossible to come back, and so Lucas had to take everything upon himself. After realizing what had happened, Lucas could not bear the pain, and so his screams could be heard far beyond the borders of their battlefield. Tears began to well up in his eyes, and along with this, he began to tell Arthur that he was using lightning magic, and that this simply could not be true, because in that case, it would turn out that Arthur had an affinity with 4 whole elements. In any case, Lucas tried to hit him again, but Arthur was too close and didn't even let him do it. He just grabbed his hand and started squeezing it as hard as it was necessary to hurt Lucas even more. And then he slowly leaned towards him and whispered in his ear that he really did possess the 4 elements with which he would destroy him. These were the last words Lucas heard in his life, because immediately after that, Arthur struck him with enough force to make Lucas fall apart into small pieces and never get in his way again. But still, Arthur was brave, and before destroying him to the very end, he gave him the opportunity to atone for his guilt, and therefore Arthur started talking about the drave that the guy mentioned before. Arthur just wanted to know, once again, whether he was definitely responsible for the incidents. This made Lucas smile, even though he was in the worst pain of his life at that moment. But this question gave him the opportunity to laugh at Arthur again and tell the guy that he took that useless idiot, whom he calls his best friend, and he was talking about Elijah. In response to these words, Arthur told his opponent that he understood perfectly well that things could happen in this world that he would ultimately be unable to influence, but he believed that at least he could make sure that his filth would not be passed on to the next generation. So much time has passed. The views of people confronted with the rising power caused fear in some, doubt in others, but delight in others. At that moment, Arthur couldn't help but think that he had long forgotten how lonely he felt in such moments, but now everything had changed. As a friend, Arthur's thoughts were interrupted when a powerful explosion thundered behind him, which literally made him run away and turn his attention to the place where Lucas was lying. The thing was that Lucas's brother came to the crime scene with his sister, and they immediately turned their attention to poor Lucas. Considering what Arthur had done to him, Brother Lucas's anger was beyond all possible limits. He was so angry that his yellow energy was literally glowing a bright yellow color. Arthur immediately realized that these were very serious problems, and our guy immediately ran towards Sivi, shouting at her that she should leave here immediately. But it was too late. They started attacking both Arthur himself and his mana beast at the same time, which caused them serious problems. Arthur was too seriously injured after Brother Lucas's attack, and all he could do at that moment was pray that he would be able to enter the second stage again, because only through this would he have any chance. Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted by the same brother of Lucas, who slowly approached Arthur and said that he and those like him did not deserve an easy death, because to commit something so brutal to a member of the West family, and even to his brother, was the worst crime in his life. He was about to finish with Arthur when suddenly Byron was stopped by Alfred, who assured him that he should not lay a finger on him. Bayram, in turn, was convinced that this boy had not only destroyed his brother, but had tortured and humiliated him before his death, and he was also saying that he had no right to touch him. Alfred became even more angry and said that this guy actually saved everyone present from the hands of Lucas, and although he understands his loss, he still recommends watching his tone and actions. Byron didn't listen to him and immediately threw his hand away, then began to actively approach Arthur and tell him that no one should test his patience, because he was not in the mood to listen to all this nonsense, and besides, he was only trying to destroy the killer who destroyed his brother. Alfred immediately called upon his warriors, who stopped Brother Lucas and prevented him from doing what he had planned. This caused Byron to become even more frustrated and angry, so he released an incredibly large amount of energy that destroyed the two guards Alfred. A few seconds later, he was already near Arthur and was preparing to deal him the final blow to destroy him once and for all. But as soon as he tried to do this, an ice wall appeared right in front of the guy, which blocked his blow and did not allow the man to do what he intended. And a few moments later, Byron was already on the ground and kneeling, with a girl behind him who assured him that it was not for him to make such decisions. She also said that the council itself would figure out what to do with the boy and the dragon, and that she, in her case, would not turn a blind eye to a breach of subordination. Byron realized that at this point, he would not be able to destroy Arthur as he had planned, and it would be best for him to accept these conditions and end it there. After some time, they began to clear away the rubble that remained after the battle. All the bodies of the dead began to be carried out, and medical assistance was provided to all those in need. The same girl who wielded ice magic approached Arthur at some point to ask him if he would need further medical assistance, to which Arthur confidently replied that he had simply exhausted his mana reserves and that everything was fine with him. Hearing this, the woman confidently told him that he would have to put it on then, and she herself held out the handcuffs towards him. Arthur didn't resist or try to prove anything. He simply held out his hands, and she, in turn, secured the handcuffs on them. And although she doubted that he would be able to break them, she still wanted to tell him not to even think about running away from her. To be on the safe side and make sure that the guy definitely wouldn't do this, she cast a special spell on him that literally fettered Arthur's every movement and didn't even give him the opportunity to move. The guy responded by saying that he understood everything perfectly. The only thing he would like to ask was for them to release his Aemon beast so that she would feel more comfortable. Hearing this request, the girl was once again surprised that this huge dragon, Mana, was Arthur's beast. But she still fulfilled Arthur's request, and if it were from Sylvie's icy shackles, she gave her the opportunity to feel more comfortable. After this, Arthur immediately told Sylvia that it would be a good idea for her to return to her fox form and calmly continue the conversation. Although the Force did not think so and she was ready to start the fight again, I convinced Arthur that even if they risked fighting them, they would not have the slightest chance. Sylvia decided to listen to her master and turned into the forest, and immediately after that ran towards him to check if everything was okay with him. She was very excited because she didn't even have a rough idea of what would happen to them next. Arthur would really like to calm him down, but he himself did not fully understand what they would do next. The only thing he could assure her of was that she did not need to worry, that everything would be fine with them. The girl then asked Arthur to follow her because they were heading to the camp of the Magicians' Guild, where they would wait for further orders from the council. Arthur walked in handcuffs and caught the eyes of absolutely everyone. Most people whispered behind his back that they heard that he destroyed a student from a noble family, and did it not just, but also mocked him. There were also rumors that it was the Wykes family, but none of them forgot to whisper that the child was part of a terrorist group, and that he simply had to be stopped so that he wouldn't destroy even more people. At that moment, Arthur was only thinking about the fact that even after everything that had happened, people were only gossiping. His thoughts were interrupted when he heard his name shouted desperately by his parents and sister from the crowd. They were very worried when they found out that the boy was tied up and being led somewhere in handcuffs. He then turned to his guide, from whom he wanted to find out whether he had the right to talk to his family. This immediately angered Byron, who believed that after everything the guy had done, he had no right to even think about such a thing. But Alfred again tried to calm him down and told him that he had to understand that the witness's testimony was not lying and the guy had done what was necessary, so he asked him not to let his emotions control him. After receiving permission from the council, Arthur immediately approached his family and told them that he was very sorry that he had forced them to rest again. He also added that there was just a small misunderstanding and there was nothing to worry about. He would soon return to his previous life, although his parents and sister were in no hurry to believe him, because they understood that they would not have put him in handcuffs for no reason. Arthur didn't tell them anything more in detail. He just noted with a smile that he would be gone for a short time, so he would have one request, which was that he would like them to take care of everyone else. While Arthur was talking with his family, the girls received a call, which symbolized that the council had apparently made its decision and was ready to announce it. So she called Arthur closer to her and began to read from Sabiu about what she had been given by the council, the general, and one of the 6 copies of Varya announces that Arthur had been given a decision. According to the general, the council decided that, given the excessive cruelty of his actions, as well as the existence of unclear circumstances, restrictions would be placed on Arthur's mana core, and he would be stripped of his title and imprisoned until further notice. Arthur wasn't too upset because he had expected this to happen, but what upset him most was that the decree would come into force from the moment it was proclaimed. The boy's father also began to tell the general that this must be some kind of mistake, because, in his opinion, Arthur saved everyone from certain death. The other guys and students of the academy also began to whisper that this was complete nonsense, because the guy definitely did not deserve this, considering what he did for them. At this point in the conversation, Arthur's friend intervened, literally screaming about how dare they punish the only person who was able to do something about the situation, and also, in her opinion, they only got out thanks to Arthur, and if it weren't for him, they wouldn't have had anyone to save. She also confidently told the general that when her parents learned about this decree, they would immediately cancel it. But the general interrupted her when she showed the decree itself, which stated that King and Queen Grider were among those who voted in favor of this decision. This incredibly surprised the girl and put her into a slight state of shock, because she could not even imagine that her parents could vote for something like this. Arthur, hearing this, immediately understood that if the decision was made and approved by 2 royal systems, it meant there was no point in arguing with copies, but the fact that she said that the guy acted excessively cruelly, without context, sounds as if Arthur was behind this attack. But he still decided to contact them once again, and before they took him away, he would like them to allow him to talk to his family one last time. The general simply had no other choice, so she allowed the guy to do it without any problems, and Arthur immediately headed to his family. He walked up to them and immediately smiled, and then assured them that they did not need to be upset, because he was sure that this misunderstanding would soon be cleared up, and he was more than sure of it. Arthur's mother, with tears in her eyes, understood perfectly well that anything could happen to the boy, and he certainly couldn't know about it. Arthur actually agreed with him completely, because this often flashed through his thoughts, but suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by his sister's voice. She was no less worried about the others, and so the guy decided to calm her down, put her on the stake in his hands, while thinking about how she was growing up really fast, and he just wanted to spend more time with her. After which he turned around and started to leave, but at the end he said that he promised them that he would leave for a short time and would return very soon. The boy's father, in turn, decided to tell his son that no matter what happened, and no matter what people say, in his opinion, the most important thing is that his family will always be on his side. After some time, Arthur was already ready to set off on a journey, and he would fly with Alfred on his fire snake, to which Alfred personally invited him, saying that the guy could not worry about it getting dirty. Although, in Arthur's opinion, even if he got burned, he couldn't do anything about it, so he essentially has no other choice. Meanwhile, Byron arrived in his homeland, holding the body of his brother in his arms. He was greeted with a smile and words about how long they had been waiting for him. Well, their smiles didn't last long, because they looked straight into his face, which showed nothing but disappointment and anger, especially after he ordered them to immediately call their father. After Byron told him what happened to Lucas, his father shouted that Lucas was a disgrace to their family and that he was not surprised that he died like that. After all, in his opinion, being killed in such a shameful manner after everything he had done for it was simply humiliating and unpleasant. Just the costs of teachers, me for the animals, elixirs, and all this in vain, so that this scoundrel would be simply destroyed at some point. After which, he turned his attention to his eldest son to find out from him for what purpose he brought his body back, since, as it seemed to him, the master was unable to avenge his family and returned back in disgrace. He was about to hit him, but Byron stopped him and asked his father to watch his words, because he was still one of the spearmen. This angered the man even more, because he had completely forgotten that after that ceremony, Bayram became even more arrogant and began to think of himself much more highly. But the man asked him not to forget that he became a spear only because he was born into the Wykes family. Well, when they came to a common understanding, The men were finally ready to listen to their eldest son about what had happened there. Byron began to tell his father that, according to witnesses, Lucas, along with a group of cultists led by a certain Dran, attacked the academy. The guy also said that the boy who destroyed Lucas did it without hesitation and with extreme cruelty. But apparently, according to Byron's stories, the father was absolutely indifferent to how his youngest son died. At that moment, he was only thinking about the fact that they still had a chance to play it out in the way they needed and emerge from this situation as winners. So he called one of his assistants and ordered her to send an emergency message to the council, which would contain information about the unfortunate attack on their family. He asked her to write in this letter that his precious son Lucas, due to a threat to his own life, was forced to submit to Dranif. He also asked her to add that it was painful for him to even imagine that such a young guy was forced to make such decisions. Yes, after all, according to the man, his son turned out to be a victim who died an excessively cruel death at the hands of a scoundrel who deserved to exist in their society. And for such a monstrous crime that was committed against the Vice family, he believed that he could not simply repent for it. He had to pay for this crime. So he really hopes that the council can make a fair decision, and in the meantime, they are preparing a decent funeral for their other son. After this fake letter, the man again turned to his eldest son and asked him there whether this was a detailed enough explanation. Baran couldn't say anything in response to these words, because he understood perfectly well that his father would do this on purpose, so he decided to simply nod, thereby agreeing with it. The gentleman's assistant interrupted their conversation when she decided to tell them that she was very sorry, and therefore she was ready to send their letter immediately. As soon as she walked out the door, the man sat down at his desk and continued doing what he had been doing, once again showing that he didn't care at all that his son had died. This couldn't help but surprise Byron, but then he realized that his father hadn't changed in this regard, and before leaving, he also wanted to know what his father would do with Lucas's funeral. The man didn't think long about this question, and as soon as he had the opportunity, he said that he didn't care at all, according to him. Anyone could do this, or no one bothered him. After which he ordered his eldest son to immediately leave him alone and go out the door, which Byron could not help but do. Besides, he himself wanted to leave here as soon as possible. While Arthur and the other copies were delivering the guy to the place they needed, he decided to clarify one question in which he wanted to know how far they were from their destination. According to his guard,